I'm excited to welcome you to the absolute best video on CSS Flexbox you're going to find anywhere on YouTube. This video is a comprehensive full course that covers every single detail you need to know to master Flexbox. Unlike other tutorials that just talk over code, my teaching style is interactive and visual to ensure you remain engaged in order to maximize your learning. I use colorful diagrams and animations to break down the theory in an easy to understand way, as well as walk you through its application step by step in a real-world project. So let's jump in. Let's begin by exploring the basics of this powerful layout system with an introduction to Flexbox. We'll be discussing what is Flexbox, Flex Container and Flex Items, main and cross axis, and Flex Direction. So what is Flexbox? Flexbox is a one-dimensional layout model, making it simple to arrange items in rows or columns and distribute space. Looking at this page over here, in the navigation bar, we have the logo and some nav links, and on the right, we have a login and try for free. This is a typical layout you'll see for a navigation bar. You can see there's space between these grouped elements, and they're arranged in a row, going from left to right. Inside the hero section, you can see these buttons. Again, there's some space between them, and they're also in a row. Looking now at the hero section, we have a heading, some paragraph text, the grouped buttons, and some images. There's space between each of these, and this is arranged in a column. Now, without Flexbox, you can kind of already achieve this layout using properties like margin and applying text align to the container so that all block and inline elements center. But Flexbox is a much more modern approach that is far more versatile and far more powerful. So let's check out this page in the browser. All right, so I'm going to open up DevTools, and let's start by clicking on the navigation bar. When I click on this div element, the navigation bar, the word Flex appears on the right here. This is signifying to us that Flexbox is being used to arrange items inside this container. You'll also note that the space between the group content is a hatched purple, which is a new color you may not have seen before. You'll also see surrounding the main container is a dashed purple line, and this is also signifying that this is a Flexbox container. Looking now at the hero section, if I select this div here, you can see once again we have that purple dashed line, but this time the content is being arranged down the page, that is, in a column. And you can also see the word flex inside the HTML markup. So let's start getting comfortable with some Flexbox terminology. We'll be looking at Flex Container and Flex Items. Flexbox has two main components. The first is called the Flex Container. This is the parent element. Inside the Flex Container, we have Flex Items. These green boxes are the Flex Items, which are the children of the Flex Container. So Flex Container is the main parent container, and the different elements inside the Flex Container are known as Flex Items, which are the children. So let's now look at how we activate Flexbox with Display Flex. The display property on a container element will activate Flexbox's layout features on children elements. You've likely come across the display property already, which has values like block, inline, and inline block. If the display property is new to you, you can check out my video in the description below. For Flexbox, we use the display value flex, and very importantly, this is declared on the Flex Container, the parent. Just for reference, values for display can include block, inline block, flex, and grid. So block, inline, and inline block are hopefully values you've already come across, and in this video, we're focusing on Flexbox, and if you are interested in learning about grid, you can check out my video in the description below. Now, I want to really highlight the difference between when you have no Flexbox, otherwise known as normal flow, and when you do have Flexbox. Let's look at no Flexbox first. This would be a display property like block, which for block elements is just default. We have a container, which acts as the parent, and for elements in block, like headings and paragraphs, they just stack vertically by default. Very importantly, the display property like block is declared on the elements, and we would describe each of these elements as block elements. Let's now compare this with Flexbox. The display property is flex. This now gives us a container, which is known as a Flex Container. And very importantly, flex is declared on the container. So in normal flow, or when not using Flexbox, the display property is applied on the child element, You've likely already seen this, where, for example, we would apply inline block onto an anchor tag. Inside our Flex container, we now have Flex items. And by default, they're not going to stack like this. They're going to be arranged in a row. So we end up with a row of Flex items. Now, what I want to try get across is that Flexbox essentially takes full control of the layout. So each of these green boxes could be a block element. Let's just say they're all paragraphs. By default, when there's no Flexbox, the paragraphs will stack one below each other. But with Flexbox, they're arranged in a row, and now Flexbox properties take full control of their alignment and spacing. In the next chapter, I'm going to be doing a much deeper dive into normal flow and Flexbox. And the reason I'm doing this is because when I started out, I found it really confusing entering the world of Flexbox and properly understanding how Flexbox completely takes control of the layout. So let's jump into VS Code and play around with this. Alright, so I've gone ahead and set up an index.html file with the boilerplate code and linked an empty app.css file. Inside the body, I'm going to add a div, and I'm going to give this the class of Flex container. This will be the parent element. Inside the div, I'm going to come and add 4 more divs. These are now the children, and in Flexbox terminology, these will be the Flex items. I'm just going to put a number on each side of them, 1, 2, 3, and 4, and I'm going to give them each a class of Flex item, and in this case, 1. I'll copy this class, change this to 2, change this to 3, and change this to 4. So once again, we have our parent div, which is going to be the Flex container, and we have 4 Flex items, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Let's jump into app.css. We'll grab the Flex container. I'm going to give it a width of 800 pixels and a height of 800 pixels. I'm just going to give this container a background color of light gray. Now, as I mentioned, it's really important to understand that the display property for Flexbox is applied on the container. So let's go add display flex. This line of code now activates Flexbox and will mean that the elements contained inside the Flex container now become Flex items. Now on the Flex container, I'm also just going to put a color of white, which will mean that the font color of our Flex items will also be white, as this will be inherited. And I'm also just going to give it a font size of 30 pixels, which once again will be inherited by the Flex items. If you don't know about inheritance, you can check out my video in the description below. So let's go get Flex item 1. I'm going to give it a width of 200 pixels, a height of 100 pixels, and let's give it a background color of blue. We'll grab Flex item 2. We'll give it a width of 50 pixels, a height of 300 pixels, and a background color of purple. We'll grab Flex item 3. Let's give it a width of 100 pixels, a height of 150 pixels, and a background color of red. And finally, Flex item 4. Let's give it a width of 150 pixels, a height of 50 pixels, and a background color of green. Now, before we check this out in the browser, I want to comment out display flex, as I want to show you what normal flow looks like when Flexbox is not activated. So let's check this out in the browser. So as expected, because each of these divs, the blue one, the purple one, the red one, and the green one, are just block elements, they're going to stack vertically like this. But now watch what happens when I turn Flexbox on. I'll uncomment this and refresh. And you'll see straight away that these are now arranged in a row, going from left to right. So the important thing to note is that where our Flex items are defined in the HTML is by default how they'll be positioned left to right. So Flex item 1 is first, and Flex item 4 is last. So from left to right, we're going 1, 2, 3, 4. So you can see how Flexbox totally takes control of the alignment of these elements. And as I mentioned in the next chapter, I'm going to be doing a much deeper dive into this idea. And we can also confirm Flexbox has been activated by opening DevTools. We can see on the main container div the word flex. And you can also see those purple dashed lines appearing. You can see purple dashed lines around the entire gray container. You can see purple dashed lines between each Flex item. And you can also see on the right some purple hatched area, which is some unused space on the right. The next really important concept we need to talk about is main and cross axis. The main axis is the primary direction in which flexed items are laid out, and the cross-axis determines distribution on the secondary axis. Okay, that was a lot to take in. Let's break it down. We have our flex container and our flex items. Now, as I'm sure you know by now, flex items by default appear in a row from left to right. This is what we call the main axis. It's the primary direction in which flex items are laid out. But there's also another axis called the cross-axis. And we can also lay out flex items in relation to this axis. Coming up soon in this topic, we're going to be looking at the properties, justify content, and align items. And these are really important properties which are used for aligning our flex items along the main axis and along the cross-axis. So just sit tight with me. We will be seeing properties that help us set alignment of our flex items, both along the main axis and along the cross-axis. But just in this introductory chapter, we need to get a good understanding of flex direction. Flex direction controls the orientation of the main axis. And very importantly, it's set on the flex container. There are 4 values this can be. The first is flex direction, row, and row is the default value. It's what we've already seen so far, where our flex items go from left to right in a row. So we have our flex item 1, flex item 2, flex item 3, and flex item 4. They're going from left to right in a row. The next property is flex direction row reverse. And as the name suggests, this essentially flips the main axis. So instead of going from left to right, it's now going from right to left, with the cross-axis still going down. So now our flex items would be positioned like this: 1, 2, 3, and 4. The flex items are going from right to left. So row and row reverse are complete opposites of each other. The next value we can have is flex direction column. This now completely changes the orientation of the main axis. Instead of going left to right or right to left, it's now going top to bottom, which means that the cross-axis is now going left to right. And our flex items would appear like this: 1, 2, 3, and 4. They're moving from top to bottom. The final value we can have for flex direction is flex direction column reverse. And as you could probably guess, this flips the direction of the main axis to now go from bottom to top, with the cross-axis still going left to right. So our flex items would now appear like this: 1, 2, 3, and 4, going from the bottom to the top. Now, when I first learned about flex direction, I was so used to coming from a mathematical background with the X and Y axis, where they don't ever change orientation. The X-axis is always horizontal, and the Y-axis is always vertical. Flexbox is not like that. The main axis, which I've shown in red, can essentially be horizontal in a row, but it can also be vertical in a column. And as we've seen now, in a row, it can go from left to right or right to left. And in a column, it can go from top to bottom and bottom to top. You'll also notice the orientation of the cross-axis doesn't really change. We're much more interested in the orientation of the main axis. So let's go play around with this inside VS Code. So I'm back inside the app.css file we worked on earlier. Inside the flex container, I'm now going to go add the property flex direction, and I'm going to initially set it to row. So let's check this out in the browser. So as you can see, there's been no changes from what we had before, and that's because the default value of flex direction is row. So if I remove this, our flex items are in a row from left to right: 1, 2, 3, and 4. Let me add it back in. Now let's go change row to row reverse, and watch what happens. The main axis is now moving from right to left. You'll also notice that these flex items completely shifted from the left side of the container to the right side. In a few chapters' time, we're going to be talking about the important property justify content, is defining how these items are distributed along the main axis. Let's now change flex direction to column. By doing that, we've shifted the main axis from bottom to top, which means that our flex items are now essentially stacked on top of each other vertically. The final value we saw was column reverse. You can see this results in the main axis now moving from bottom to top, where our flex items now start at the bottom of the container and move up the column. And again, you would have noticed how the flex items have now moved from the top of the container to the bottom of the container. Now, one thing I really would like to highlight, because it can be confusing, is that both the display property for flex and flex direction property are defined on the container. They're not defined on the flex items themselves, but on the container. So let's now take a look at some flex direction guidance. In most cases, flex direction is set to row or column. So let's look at some examples of flex direction row first. And as I've mentioned, you do not explicitly need to set flex direction row as it is the default value. So looking back at this web page here, the two buttons in the hero section, we could use Flexbox to arrange. The buttons are in a row, so the main axis is moving from left to right. We have our cross axis, we have our flex container, and each of the buttons are a flex item. So it's very common to have your main axis going from left to right, that is flex direction row. And again, you don't explicitly need to set this because that is the default value of Flexbox. Looking now at our navigation bar, again, we have items going from left to right. So our main axis is moving from left to right. We have our cross axis, our flex container containing all the items. We have a group of elements on the left, which is our first flex item. And we have a group of elements on the right, which is our second flex item. Let's now look at a case where we use flex direction column. Earlier on in this chapter, we looked at this web page, and the main hero section is in a column. The content is moving from top to bottom. So our main axis looks like this. The cross axis looks like this. We have our flex container and 4 different flex items, which are arranged in a column, moving from top to bottom. So again, flex direction row, which is the default value, and flex direction column are by far the most common values you are going to use. So let's start building a summary card, an introduction to Flexbox. In this chapter, we looked at flex container and items. We saw that we activate Flexbox by using the display property and setting its value to flex. This then gives us a flex container, which is the parent, and inside it, we have flex items, which are the children. We have a main axis, which by default is in row and moves from left to right, and we have a cross axis, which is the secondary axis. We also looked at flex direction. We saw that there were 4 possible values. Flex direction row, where we have our main axis moving from left to right, and our cross axis moving from top to bottom. Flex direction row places our flex items in a row from left to right. So it would look like this: 1, 2, 3, and 4. We saw flex direction row reverse, where our main axis now moves from right to left. The cross axis still from top to bottom. So our flex items are arranged like this: 1, 2, 3, and 4. We then saw flex direction column, where the main axis now moves from top to bottom, the cross axis left to right. Because our main axis now moves top to bottom, our flex items are arranged like this: 1, 2, 3, and 4. The final value we saw was flex direction column reverse, where the main axis now moves from bottom to top, and the cross axis still left to right. This then arranges our flex items like this: 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now, as I mentioned, this can seem very overwhelming with all these different directions flying around. By far, you're going to be using flex direction row, which is just the default value, and flex direction column. So don't worry too much about this. Just understand that the main axis can shift from a horizontal row position to a vertical column position. Now, I know we haven't really spoken about the secondary axis that much, and it may just seem like it's kind of floating there for now, not doing much. In a few chapters' time, we are going to see the importance of the secondary axis, because we can align our flex items both along the main axis as well as the cross axis. So just sit tight, we will see a use for it soon. Next, we'll get a solid understanding of how Flexbox takes full control of the layout of elements by taking a look at normal flow versus Flexbox. We'll be discussing normal flow, Flexbox, and comparing normal flow and Flexbox. Now, this chapter is getting my more difficult stand. When I was starting out, It just took me a bit of time to really understand how Flexbox now fully takes control of child elements inside a Flex container. Now, I'm going to spend a lot of time in this chapter diving deep into the difference between normal flow and Flexbox, so hopefully it will be a bit easier for you starting out. But there is just a little bit of a jump in understanding. So let's start out by looking at the difference between normal flow and Flexbox. When Flexbox is applied to a container, it takes control of the alignment of the children. So looking at normal flow first, spacing and alignment are determined by inherent properties of block and inline elements. So let's say we have a container. Inside the container, we have block elements and an inline element. So this is normal flow with no Flexbox. And all the spacing and alignment properties are inherent in the block and inline element properties. For example, the inline element just takes up the width of the content. Comparing this now to Flexbox. Flexbox overrides default behavior of block and inline elements, with spacing and alignment now controlled by Flexbox properties. So in Flexbox, we have our Flex container. And now for the children, we need to think of these not as block and inline elements, but just as Flex items. So let's take a deep dive into normal flow. Block and inline elements behave differently in normal flow. Let's say we have a div container. We know that the width of the parent container sets the width of the block elements. So let's say we had a block element, which is an H1, and another block element being a paragraph. The block elements stretch the full width of their container and stack vertically. Comparing this to inline elements, where we have an image and two anchor tags, inline elements have a width equal to their content and sit next to each other. Now, because inline elements don't take up the full width of the page, there's space between the inline element and the edge of the container, and at the bottom as well. So let's go check this out inside VS Code. Alright, I've prepared this index.html file. I have a div with the class container, which is containing these elements: an image, a heading, a paragraph, and two anchor tags. Inside app.css, I'm just going to select the container, and I'm going to give it a background color of light gray. So let's check this out in the browser. So I'm going to open up DevTools, and I'm just going to select the different block and inline elements. As we know by now, a block element like an H1 extends the full width of the page, and will always start on a new line, like this paragraph over here. For the inline elements, they just occupy the width of their content. In this case, 187 pixels. And for the anchor tags, the length of the text results in the width being 69.75 pixels. And we know inline elements can sit next to each other. Now with normal flow, when applying box model properties to inline elements, they apply kind of weirdly. For example, if I select the anchor tag and try out a height of 50 pixels, and I'll just give it a background color so we can see this, I'll refresh, and you can see the background color has been applied, but the height has not been applied. Just to confirm that, I'll make it a much bigger value, and you'll see height is just not being applied to an inline element. This is not the case for a block element. If I select the H1, give it a height of 100 pixels, and a background color of blue, you'll see that the height is being applied. In the box model, we can see the content is 100 pixels high. With inline elements like anchor tag, properties like padding also apply quite weirdly. I'll remove the height, and I'll add a padding of 50 pixels. I'll refresh, and you can see we get this weird behavior where the anchor tag is almost overlapping other content. This doesn't happen with block elements. I'll remove the height on the heading, and I'll give it some padding of 100 pixels. I'll refresh, and you'll see the padding is applied and the content surrounding it is pushed down. Now we did fix this by changing the display property on the anchor tag to inline block. So if I do this, this will now result in box model properties applying correctly to inline elements. Now, if all of this is new to you, you can check out my video on the box model in the description below. Now, the main idea from this demonstration I just went through is that in normal flow, the positioning and size is heavily determined by whether an element is a block and inline element. And furthermore, box model properties apply a bit weirdly by default to inline elements. The next thing to discuss with normal flow is normal flow and alignment. Applying text align to a block level parent will impact both block and inline children through different mechanisms. I've got the same diagram we just looked at before, and I'm now going to apply text align center to the parent block element, the div. By doing this, two things happen at the same time. The first is that the text inside the block elements will center, and this is being achieved through inheritance. The text-align center property is being passed down to the H1 and the paragraph, which effectively applies text-align center to each of those elements, which then centers the text. The second thing happening is that the image and anchor tags, the inline elements, have space to move. So applying text-align center will center these elements. So the inline elements are being centered because they are a direct child of the div. Now applying text-align center directly to an inline element won't center it. But when text-align center is applied to a parent, like a div, all elements, whether they're block or inline, will center inside the container. So let's go play around with this inside VS Code. All right, so I'm just going to go remove a few things. I'm going to remove all our styles on the anchor tag in H1. I'll refresh, and now I'm going to go apply text-align center onto the container. And you'll see that all elements are centered. And just to highlight what I was talking about before, if I remove text-align center from the container and put everything back to where it was, and apply text-align center to an inline element, like our anchor tag, you'll see that nothing happens, whereas it does work for a block, like the H1. So once again, applying text-align center to a container will center both block and inline elements. So hopefully that was a good recap of normal flow behavior of block and inline elements. Let's now look at how this all changes with Flexbox. Flexbox overrides display behavior of block and inline elements. By applying the property displayFlex to the parent container, it totally overrides block and inline elements. We have our flex container, and the elements are now flex items, overriding the inherent nature of block and inline elements. You can see all elements now start on their own line and by default stretch the full width of the container. So we no longer view our elements now as block and inline when inside a flex container. They're flex items. What were inline elements like images and anchor tags now each appear on their own line and also stretch the full width of the page. Let's play around with this inside VS Code. So I'm back inside our app.css file and I've removed a bunch of styles. I just have the container element with the background color being applied. And just to reinforce normal flow, by opening up DevTools, we can see that our block elements extend the full width of the page, and our inline elements are just the width of their content and do not start on a new line. So let's now convert this to a flex container. I'll add display flex, and just so we can keep the orientation the same, I'm going to add flex direction column. I'll refresh, and you'll now see when I open up DevTools, that all elements extend the full width of the page. The image has been fully stretched. You can also see the anchor tags stretch the full width of the page and now appear on separate lines. They're no longer next to each other. You can see as well, when I select the container, we get those purple lines appearing, separating each element. And these are our flex items. Now, the other interesting thing that happens is because we no longer view these as block and inline elements, applying box model properties to inline elements works. For example, if I select the anchor tag, give it a height of 100 pixels and a background color of red, I'll refresh, and you'll see the height is being applied to the anchor tag. I'll confirm this in DevTools. I'll select the element, and you'll see it has a height of 100 pixels. If you recall when I did this earlier in normal flow, height didn't apply. I'm also going to show you what happens with padding. I'll remove height and add a padding of 50 pixels. I'll refresh, and you'll see padding is also being applied. We're getting 50 pixels of padding all the way around the element. And if you remember in normal flow with inline elements, we had that weird effect where the inline element kind of hovered over some of the other content. So in a nutshell, when our container becomes a flex container, our children now become flex items. Don't think of them as block and inline, because they just don't behave like that anymore. The inline elements appear on a new line, and they stretch the full width of the page. And we can also apply box model properties to them as if they were block elements. I'm just going to go remove this anchor tag, and I'm going to go in on the image and add a width of 100 pixels. So this would be something fairly common to do. We can still add a width to our image to keep it the size we actually want. Opening up DevTools, we can see that our image is now 100 pixels, but you can see it's inside the flex item, which still stretches the full width of the page. Now, the final thing I want to discuss is comparing alignment in normal flow and Flexbox. In normal flow, we have a setup like this, where applying text align to the parent container centers everything. We discussed earlier, for the block elements, the heading and the paragraph, inheritance results in text centering inside the element. And for the inline elements, in normal flow, text align centered the image and links, as they're just children of the parent container with space to move. Now with Flexbox, we have a setup like this. The top box is the image, where I've applied a fixed width, like we just did a second ago in VS Code. And our headings, paragraphs, and anchor tags all appear on separate lines and stretch the full width of the page. If I were to now apply text align center onto the Flex container, inheritance is still at play. It's being passed down inside each Flex item. So it's kind of like text align is now being applied to the heading, paragraph, and anchor tags. And because we no longer view these as block and inline elements, but now Flex items, text align center will center this text inside the Flex item. Again, we can't view our anchor tags as inline elements anymore. They're just Flex items. However, even with space available, text align no longer moves the image as it doesn't control alignment. This image won't center like it will in normal flow, and that's because Flexbox properties now control alignment, which we're going to be seeing in the next few chapters. Text align will not move a child like it did in normal flow. Let's check this out in VS Code. Alright, so I'm back in the app.css file we were working on earlier. I'm going to come and apply text align center inside our Flex container. I'll refresh and watch what happens. The heading, paragraph, and anchor tags are all centered. Text align center is being inherited by each of these. If I open up DevTools, you can see each Flex item surrounded by the purple dashed lines. You can see there's a lot of space horizontally for these items to move. Because they're all text items, a heading, which is text, a paragraph, which is text, and an anchor tag, which is also text, the text align is being inherited. So it's kind of the same thing as this. If I remove text align center here, I select the heading, paragraph, and the anchor tag, and directly apply text align center to them, you'll see that there's no change. It's all still centered. Now the big thing to realize is that in normal flow, if I were to apply text align center to an anchor tag, it wouldn't center it. Whereas in Flexbox, it does, because we no longer view it as an inline element. I'm going to add text align center back here. I'll refresh. And as I've mentioned, the image is not being centered because text align center no longer controls alignment like it does in normal flow. We need a specific Flexbox property to center this, which we'll be looking at soon. Just to remind you again of normal flow, I'll comment out the Flexbox properties, I'll refresh, and you'll see the image is now centered. And that's because in normal flow, when applying text align center onto a container, inline elements are just seen as boxes, that is, children, and they will center because there's space. That works on the inline elements like the images and the anchor tags, whereas in normal flow for block elements, when applying text align center onto a container, these are centered through inheritance. Alright, so let's finish off the introduction to Flexbox summary card. In this chapter, we looked at normal flow versus Flexbox. We saw that Flexbox overrides block and inline behavior. Inside normal flow, we have a parent container with a block element and an inline element. These elements have inherent behavior, like an inline element taking up the width of its content. And we also saw applying text align center to a block element container like a div. We'll center both the text inside the block element and move the inline element to the middle. For Flexbox, we now have a Flex container and Flex items. Flexbox completely overrides block and inline behavior, where now inline elements stretch the full width of the page. And also, we can apply box model properties to what were inline elements without any problem. We also saw that text align center doesn't always work and won't move something like an image with a fixed width, because text align center is no longer responsible for alignment inside a Flex container. Now I know this was a lot to take in, and that's why I gave it my more difficult stamp at the start. If you can just walk away from this chapter appreciating that when you apply Flexbox to the container, it will completely override block and inline behavior, and we now also need to use additional properties to align our Flex items, then you're doing great. Now it's time to learn about how to control alignment and spacing of elements along the main axis using justified content. we'll be looking at flex container size, the justify content property, justify content values, and justify content and shifting the main axis. So we're now up to an exciting part of our Flexbox journey, where we can start looking at aligning and spacing flex items. Flexbox offers a powerful way to space and align content. Looking at this web page over here, the nav bar, which is a flex container shown in purple, has two flex items in green. Flexbox makes it simple to align and create space between these flex items. Now, before we look at justify content, we need to talk about the flex container size. Understanding a flex container's dimensions is essential for visualizing how flex items will be positioned. When thinking about the size of a flex container, there are two categories. The first is a general block container. We have our browser window and our flex container, which in this case is just a block element, like a div. And by default, the block element extends the full width of the container. Let's pop in our main axis and add in some flex items. So along the main axis, there's quite a lot of space. There's space between the last flex item in yellow and the edge of the browser window. Another important note is that the height of the flex container is being determined by the flex items. In this case, the height of the green flex item is setting the height of the entire flex container. This means that there's no space between the largest flex item and the flex container. The other category of flex container is a container with a set height or width. Again, we have our browser, but we now have a flex container that looks like this. In this case, the width is set, and the height is also set. Let's pop in our main axis, add in our flex items. We can see the amount of horizontal space here, which you can see is now smaller than the general block container. And in this case, because we've got a height set larger than the height of the biggest flex item, there is now vertical space. Now, the reason I want to get you thinking about where space is inside flex containers is that because in this chapter and the next chapter, we're going to be moving our flex items around. And it's really, really important to understand how much space there is vertically and horizontally to appreciate how our flex items are going to move. Inside VS Code, we had set up this example earlier. We have 4 flex items inside a flex container. This flex container is an example of where width and height has been set. And if I zoom out a bit, you can see that there's space horizontally from the edge of the green flex item to the edge of the flex container. And there's also space vertically from the top edge of the purple flex item here to the edge of the flex container here. Let's comment out those width and height properties. You'll see now that the horizontal space has now expanded and goes all the way up to the edge of the browser window, and that there is no vertical space between the largest flex item and the container. The largest flex item is setting the height of the container. So now that we've got a good understanding of spacing within our flex container, let's finally talk about justify content. Justify content sets how flex items are positioned along the main axis. It looks like this, where justify content is the property, and flex start is an example of one of the values. So we have our flex container, and what's really important is that justify content is set on the container. A lot of the next few properties we're going to be looking at are all set on the container and not the flex items themselves. We then have our main axis and our different flex items. So justify content sets how these flex items are positioned along the main axis. In this case, the value is flex start, so they're all at the start of the main axis, that is, on the left. So let's now take a look at all the justify content values. The one we've just seen is justify content flex start. We have our flex container, our main axis, and our flex items. The flex start value has all the flex items starting on the left of the main axis. And this is the default value. It's where our flex items are positioned by default, and what we've already seen in all the examples we've done so far. The next value we'll look at is flex end. And as the name suggests, this now positions all our flex items at the end of the main axis. The next value we'll look at is center. We have our flex container, our main axis, and as you'd guessed, the value center centers all our flex items along the main axis. The next value is space between. We have our flex container, our main axis. The first and last flex items are placed right at the edge of the container, and the remaining flex items are then inserted so that there's equal space between all the flex items. The next value is space around. We have our flex container, our main axis. Now this one works slightly different to space between. For space around, we divide our flex container into equal spacing along the main axis, and then our flex items are centered inside each of these blocks. So what we end up with is that the spacing between the orange, green, blue, and yellow flex items will be double the spacing between the orange flex item and the edge of the flex container, and the yellow flex item and the edge of the flex container. The last value is space evenly, with our flex container, our main axis. In this case, our flex items are all just spaced evenly between each other and the edge of the flex container. So there's equal spacing between all our flex items. This is different to space around, where there isn't equal spacing between all the flex items and the edge of the container. So these are all the 6 possible values for justify content. And just to hammer the point home, justify content is all about spacing our flex items along the main axis. Now I know this can seem a little bit overwhelming, especially the 3 values on the right, space between, space around, and space evenly, as the differences are quite subtle. Honestly, don't worry too much about them. We use some of them a lot more than others. So let's go play around with these inside VS Code. So I'm back inside our app.css file. On the flex container, let's go add justify content, and we'll start with the first value, flex start. I'll refresh, and you'll see nothing changes. And that's just because flex start is the default value. Our flex items are always aligned left by default. Let's change this to flex end. I'll refresh, and you'll see our flex items now shift to the right. The next value we looked at was center. This nicely centers our flex items. We then looked at space between. This places our first and last flex items right at the edge of the flex container, and then inserts the remaining flex items with equal spacing between all the flex items. The next value was space around, and if you remember, this divided the flex container into 4 equal blocks and inserted the flex items in the center of them. And this left us with double the spacing between the flex item and the edge of the container. And we can better see this in DevTools. If I select the flex container, you can see the spacing of the hatched purple on the far left and far right is half the horizontal spacing between all the other flex items. The last value we looked at was space evenly, and this simply spaces our flex items evenly between each other and the edge of the flex container. Now thinking back to those 2 categories of flex container, where we had a general block container, just like this, where it extends the full width of the page, versus a container with set width and height. Let's uncomment this and refresh. Now the reason I want to show you this is that now the flex container has a set width, so it's not extending the full width of the page. Now because the flex container now has a set width, which is lower than the width of the browser, the spacing between our items will just be smaller. So let's run through them one more time. So we'll do flex start, and just to highlight this a bit more, I'm going to come and change the width to 600 pixels. So as expected, our flex items are on the left. Let's change this to flex end. You can see our flex items have moved to the right, but compared to before, it's not like it moved all the way to the right. It has moved right, but because the container has a fixed width, which is smaller than the browser width, the amount it's moved doesn't look like much. Let's go center them, and you can see again, the spacing between all the flex items and the edge of the container is a lot smaller. We'll do space between, and again, the spacing values are a lot smaller. Space around, and once again, the spacing values are a lot smaller. And finally, space evenly. And again, the spacing values are a lot smaller. So the point of me doing this was really to highlight that the amount of spacing of flex items along the main axis is heavily influenced on the size of the flex container. And we've seen it can either be a general block container or a container with fixed width and height. I now want to spend some time discussing spacing on the shifted main axis when we move it from row to column. That is, our main axis is now going vertically instead of horizontally. Let's again look at our 2 different cases. The general block container will set a flex direction of column. This now results in our main axis going from top to bottom with our flex items, and the flex items is what's actually setting the height of the flex container now. That is, the height of each flex item adds up to give the height of the flex container. And this results in no space between the flex items and the container. So if we come and set a value like justify content center, different values will have no effect on placement of flex items as there is no space. So because there is no space along the main axis inside the flex container, setting any value on justify content will have no effect. Let's now compare this with a container with a set height. Again, we'll set flex direction column. This will result in our main axis going from top to bottom. Our flex container has a defined fixed height. We'll pop in our flex items. And now there is space between our flex items and the edge of the flex container. So we can set a value like center for justify content. And different values will have an effect on placement of flex items as there is now space. So let's play around with this inside VS Code. So I'm back inside the file we were working on earlier. Let's go first through the case when the flex container has no width and height. I'll comment that out. The next thing I need to do is shift the main axis. So we'll go flex direction column. I'll refresh, and you can see that the height of the container is being determined by the height of each flex item. If I open up DevTools and inspect, you'll see by looking at the box model, the height of the flex container is 600 pixels, which is the sum of 100, 300, 150, and 50. So again, for a general block container with no set height, the height is being set by the height of each flex item. And because there is no space, any justify content value will have no impact. And that's because there's no space along the main axis for our flex items to shift. So let's go set this to a value like center. You'll see there's no change. We'll change it to space between, and again, no change. Let's now compare this to a container with a set height. I'm going to uncomment these values. I'll zoom out a bit. And because our flex container now has a fixed height of 800 pixels, and the sum of each of the heights of the flex items was 600 pixels, there's 200 pixels of space for our flex items to move. So setting different values on justify content will have an impact. So let's now take a look at some justify content guidance. Justify content is often used to align and space navigation bars. You can see on this web page here, the navigation bar will all be inside a flex container. We have our main axis going from left to right. We have a logo on the far left and anchor tags on the far right. These would be our flex items. And we're using justify content to space these flex items along the main axis. Let's check this page out. So I'll open up DevTools. I'll go select the navigation bar, and you can see this is a flex container. If we look at the CSS properties, we can see that justify content is being used with the value space between. Space between is essentially inserting space between the two flex items, pushing the flex items to the left and right. This is a common value you'd be using on a navigation bar. Looking at some more guidance, it can be used to align entire sections. Looking at this page over here, this entire section content would be inside a flex container. We have our main axis in row going from left to right. We have a flex item on the left and a flex item on the right. Now, one thing to note is that Flexbox gives us a simple way to place elements next to each other horizontally. Without Flexbox, this isn't so easy to do. So let's check this out in the browser. So I'm going to open up DevTools, and I'm going to select this flex container. Now, in actual fact, the justify content value is actually not doing anything here. If I turn it off, you'll see there's no change. And that's because we're just using Flexbox as a way to get these elements next to each other. There is no need for a justify content value. This actually can be fairly common, where we're just using Flexbox to position items next to each other, and we don't actually need to specify a justify content value. Here's another example of how Flexbox can be used to align entire sections. All of this content is in a flex container. We have our main axis now in column, going from top to bottom. Inside the flex container, we have a section of content here and a section of content here. And these are our flex items. So let's check this page out. So I'm first going to zoom out quite a lot. I'm going to open up DevTools. I'll select the entire section. You can see flex over here and the flex container with those dashed purple lines. You can see flex direction is in column. And if I turn that off, you'll see it all moves to row. And you'll see justify content is set to center. But if I turn that off, nothing really happens. And once again, that's just because we're using Flexbox as a way to align these items vertically. For this particular layout, there's no need to provide a specific value. Moving on to the next piece of guidance, it's often used for spacing and alignment of simple one-dimensional components. Looking at this web page over here, I'm going to zoom in to the icon and projects. All of this would be inside a Flex container. Our main axis is in row running from left to right. We have our icon and text, and these would be our Flex items. So again, we're just using Flexbox to easily position items horizontally. So let's check this out in the browser. So I'm going to open up DevTools. I'll grab the container. You can see this is a Flex container. As you'd expect, we have display set to Flex. Our Flex direction is row. This is there even though it's not totally necessary, as row is the default value. And you'll see that justify content is set to Flex Start. And technically, this is not needed either, because Flex Start is just the default value. But you can see the power of Flexbox. It easily allows us to position these items next to each other. Now, one question you may have is we do have spacing between the icon and the word projects. So if justify content is not being used there, what is being used? We will be discussing this in a few chapters' time, but there's this property called gap you can see over here, currently set to 16 pixels. And as the name suggests, you can use this to define a specific gap value between your Flex items. So if I turn this off, you'll see that projects butts right up against the icon. While we're on this page, I want to show you some other places we're using Flexbox for simple one-dimensional layouts. I'm going to scroll right to the top, and I'm going to click the container of these buttons. You can see this is also Flexbox. Flexbox is being used to nicely position these buttons next to each other. The last example I want to show you is that if I scroll down, we have these different tabs over here. If I select one of these tabs, you can see that Flexbox is also being used here to place the icon next to the text. And like we've seen in other cases, the Flex container actually has no space for our Flex items to move. This small space in purple here is created by this gap value. If I turn that off, you'll see that we're just using Flexbox to position our elements next to each other. And because there's no space, we can't even use justify content, because we need space inside our Flex container for justify content to work. So again, I just wanted to really highlight, oftentimes we don't even need to set a justify content value to position items along our main axis, because in a lot of circumstances, there actually won't be any space. The last example of a simple one-dimensional layout I want to look at is this page over here. We have all these logos inside a Flex container. We have our main axis in row running from left to right, and each of these logos would be a Flex item. In this case, a value for justify content is being used, because there is space inside this container to space our items along the main axis. Let's check this out in the browser. So I'll open up DevTools. We'll grab the Flex container. I'll go check out the properties. You'll see we have display Flex as expected, and over here, justify content space between. If I turn this off, you'll see all the icons inside the Flex items butt up against each other. And you can see over here, on the right, the amount of available space inside this Flex container. I'll turn justify content space between back on, and you'll see that using this property nicely aligns our logos along the row with equal space between them all. So let's start building out the next summary card, justify content and align items. In this chapter, we looked at justify content, which positions items along the main axis. We saw there were 6 possible values. Flex Start, which is the default value I'm going to put in red. For Flex Start, we have our Flex container, our main axis going from left to right, and our Flex items positioned along the main axis at the start of the main axis. That is, in this case, on the left. The next value is Flex End. We have our Flex container, our main axis going from left to right. This means that Flex End is on the right of our main axis, so our Flex items are positioned like this. The next value we saw was Center. We have our Flex container, our main axis going from left to right, and our Flex items will be centered along the main axis. The next value was Space Between. We have our Flex container, our main axis. The Flex items on the far left and far right are pushed right up against the Flex container, and then any remaining Flex items are positioned with equal spacing between each of the Flex items. The next value was Space Around. We have our Flex container, our main axis. The space is then divided equally, and our Flex items are placed in the center of each of these blocks. And if you recall, this means that the space between each Flex item is double the space between the edge of the Flex container and the Flex items on the left and right. The last value was spaced evenly. We have our flex container, our main axis, and this simply just spaces the flex items evenly with equal spacing between the flex items and the edges of the container. Now that we have a solid grasp of the fundamentals, it's time to apply our knowledge to a real-world web application. One we'll continuously build upon in each chapter as we explore new properties. For this part of the video, I recommend you download the starter HTML and CSS files in the description below and code along with me. We will be working on the homepage for a major full-stack web application called Quill, which you can learn more about in the description below. This project is part of my CSS full course, where we build the Quill homepage from scratch. You can join me for free in my CSS full course on YouTube by clicking in the video appearing in the top right now. Now we're going to be using Flexbox a lot on the homepage, but just to start off with, I'm only going to be using it in two circumstances. And as we move through this topic, I will be adding more instances of Flexbox. The first place I want to use Flexbox is on the navigation bar. We're going to convert our entire nav bar into a flex container. Our main axis will be in row, running from left to right. Our Quill logo will be a flex item, and our two anchor tags will also be a flex item. We're then going to use the justify content space between property to create space between the flex items, just like we saw in some of the previous guidance. So let's jump into VS Code and code this up. So I'm inside index.html of our Quill project. As you can see, we have the nav bar inside the semantic nav element, and this already has a class navbar. We're going to go now convert this nav into a flex container. So we'll jump into app.css. I'm going to scroll down to the different sections, and you can see our navbar class over here. Now, before I add anything, I want you to note that the current layout by default in normal flow is we have our Quill logo and then our login and register anchor tags, which are one below another because they're inside list items. So let's go add display flex onto the navbar. I'll refresh and watch what happens. The login and register anchor tags now appear next to the Quill logo. Now you might be wondering, why didn't register appear next to login? Why are these kind of grouped together? If we jump into the index.html file, because we applied a flex container onto our navbar, the flex items are direct children of the navbar. That is this anchor tag, which is wrapping our image. So it's effectively just our image, which is over here, and our unordered list, which has the login and register anchor tags. So it's really important to understand that when you add display flex onto a flex container, like our nav, the flex items are just the direct children, not grandchildren like these list items. So in our case, the anchor tag is one flex item, and the entire unordered list is another flex item. We are later on in this topic going to be talking about nested Flexbox. That is, Flexbox inside of Flexbox. And we're going to be using that to pop our registered anchor tag next to our login. But it's really, really important to understand that flex items are direct children of the flex container. And that is why the login and register are grouped together like this and still appear one below another, because they're inside our unordered list tags, and the unordered list tag is the flex item. Jumping back to app.css, to be explicit, we could put flex direction as row. If I refresh, you'll see no changes. I'm not going to do this because it's not necessary. I'll remove it, but let's now go add justify content and space between. I'll refresh and check that out. With 2 lines of code, we've now beautifully positioned our image on the left and our buttons on the right. All right, the next place I want to use Flexbox is inside our footer. We're going to convert the entire footer into a flex container. In this case, our main axis will now be in column, running from top to bottom. Now, flex items will be the logo, the social media icons, the navigation text, and the small text at the bottom. In the guidance, we spoke about using Flexbox to align and space entire sections, and that's what we're going to be doing inside the footer. And just to note, importantly, there is no space along the main axis. As you'll recall, justify content is about aligning and spacing flex items along the main axis. Our main axis is now in column, and there actually is no space, which means we won't be using justify content. But we are going to be using Flexbox as a new and more versatile way to set up our footer. So let's jump into VS Code and code this up. So our footer currently looks like this. And in actual fact, after we've done the work with Flexbox in this chapter, there's going to be no visual change. But the benefit of using Flexbox is that we're able to unlock some more powerful features, which we'll be seeing later on with values like gap. So even though for now we're going to be doing some work which won't really achieve anything new, using Flexbox is a powerful way to structure layout for entire sections, like this footer over here. Let's take a second to look at the index.html file. We're going to be converting our footer into a Flex container. So let's now identify the different Flex items. The direct children, which will be the Flex items, is this anchor tag, which is wrapping an image, which is the Quill logo. It's this unordered list, which is the group of social media icons. It's this unordered list, which is a mini navigation with the home, login, and register anchor tags. And the final Flex item is this paragraph, made with love in London. So again, it's really important to be able to identify your Flex items. And just to really hammer the point home, these list items are not Flex items of the footer. It's only the direct children which are Flex items. So let's jump back into app.css. Let's go add display Flex to convert the footer container into a Flex container. Let's just refresh to see what happens. So by default, our main axis is running from left to right in a row. And that's why the Flex items appear next to each other like this. We want this to appear in a column. So we're going to add Flex direction and add the value column. Let's refresh. And you'll see we're actually back to where we started. But now this is a Flex container. Now, one thing I do want to highlight, which we spoke about in an earlier chapter, is how we shouldn't really be using text align to space and align items in a Flex container, because it doesn't really work. But in this case, it kind of is working. If I comment this out, you'll see that our Flex items all appear on the left here. Now, our main axis is running from top to bottom. And as we mentioned earlier, there's no space over there, so justify content won't have any effect. But there is space now along the cross axis. If I open up DevTools, you can see there's a lot of space horizontally. And we're going to be talking in the next chapter about aligning and spacing items along the cross axis. If I turn text align center back on, it does center everything. This seems contradictory to what I spoke about earlier, where I said text align center doesn't really work in Flex containers. Just to remind you of that, in the Flexbox versus normal flow chapter, I set up this, where we had our Flex container, an image, an h1, paragraph, and anchor tags. In app.css, we have display Flex, our Flex direction is column, and applying text align center centers the headings, paragraphs, and anchor tags. If I open up DevTools, if I click the anchor tag, you'll see the anchor tag stretches the full width of the page, which is not typical behavior of inline elements. But by converting it to a Flex container, this now becomes a Flex item, and the idea of inline elements doesn't really apply. This is different to the logo, which has a fixed width of 100 pixels. If I try click away from this, I'm taken straight to the purple dashes of the Flex container. This is different to the anchor tag, where you can see by default, the blue box extends the full width of the container. The image doesn't, it's just the width of the image. So trying to apply text align center onto an element with a fixed width like this image simply doesn't work. And that's because text align is no longer taking control of alignment. The only reason the heading and anchor tags are being text align centered is because they're being inherited. So they are centering. So why then is the image centering here? That is completely contradictory to what I spoke about here. Now the reason this is happening is because in our markup, our image is actually inside anchor tags. You can see that over here. The image is wrapped in anchor tags. So the anchor tags are in fact inheriting text align center. Just to really show you this, if I copy this image and paste it over here, I'll refresh, and you'll see this image is behaving exactly like I said here. It's not centering. If I open up DevTools, you'll see this image is inside an anchor tag, and you can see the blue box highlights the space it can move. Whereas this image just has a fixed width, and as soon as I move away, I'm just showing the entire Flex container. All right, I'm just going to go remove this image and refresh. Now, this may all seem very confusing, but what I really want to highlight is that text align center isn't really the best way to center items like this. We're going to be seeing in the next chapter a new property which is better used for centering Flex items along the cross axis. So for now, I'm actually just going to go remove this. This will then place all our items on the left by default, and in the next chapter, we will be correcting this. I really wouldn't overthink this too much, as I know it can seem confusing, but the main point I want you to walk away with is that inside a Flex container, We're learning about Flexbox properties like justify content and align items in the next chapter, which is the correct way to properly align and space your Flex items. Text align is not the correct way to space items inside Flex containers. The last thing I just want to show you is that, as I mentioned, justify content will have no effect because there is no space along our Flex container along the main axis, that is, going from top to bottom. I'll open up DevTools. I'll grab our Flex container. You can see I've added justify content center. I'll refresh, there's no change. I'll add space between, and you'll see once again there is no change. And that's because there is no space inside our Flex container along the main axis. But you can see there is a lot of space horizontally, that is, along the cross axis. And in the next chapter, we're going to be using that to center our Flex items. So as I've just shown, justify content has no effect, so I'm going to go just remove it from our footer. So we've learned about alignment and spacing along the main axis. Now it's time to learn about alignment and spacing along the cross axis with align items. We'll be discussing the align items property, align items values, and align items and shifting the main axis. So what is align items? Align items sets how Flex items are positioned along the cross axis. The CSS property looks like this, align-items with a value like stretch. Just like justify content, align items is also set on the Flex container. And the value stretch is the default value. And we'll be looking at all the values soon. So let's take a look at our Flexbox diagram. We have our Flex container, which is the parent. We have our main axis, which in this case has a flex direction of road, which means it's running from left to right. We then have our different Flex items, which we know are the children. And we have our cross axis, which runs perpendicular to our main axis. And align items is all about the positioning along the cross axis. So justify content, which we looked at previously, is about spacing and alignment along the main axis. And align items, which we're going to be looking at now, is about positioning and spacing along the cross axis. So let's take a look at the different align items values. Just like I detailed in the justify content chapter, situations where the container has height and situations where the container does not have height, I'm going to be doing the same thing for aligned items. So when no height is set on the container, its height is set by the height of the tallest Flex item. So let's take a look at all the values. The first one we have is align item stretch, and this is the default value. It looks like this. We have our Flex container, our main axis running from left to right, our cross axis running from top to bottom, and by default, our Flex items will stretch, so they'll look like this. Now just a small note, this occurs when our Flex items also don't have a fixed height, so just content. And we'll be looking at this soon inside VS Code. But let's continue running through all the values. The next value is Flex start. We have our Flex container, our main axis, our cross axis, and our Flex items are now at the start of the cross axis. So this is at the top of the cross axis. Now in justify content, Flex start would also look like this, but that's because our main axis is running from left to right. So Flex start, in terms of justify content, positions the Flex items on the left of the main axis. Now align items is positioning along the cross axis. So in this case, Flex start means at the top of the cross axis. We then have align items Flex end. We have our Flex container, our main axis, our cross axis, and our Flex items will look like this. That is at the end of the cross axis. You can see it's the complete opposite of align items Flex start. The next value is align items center, with our Flex container, our main axis, our cross axis, and our Flex items will now be centered on the cross axis, so it'll look like this. The final value is align items baseline. So for this one, we have our Flex container, our main axis, our cross axis. Now to show you how this works, I'm going to add text inside our Flex items. We have a Flex item with the letter A inside, and then I have a Flex item with the letter B, which I've made a lot larger, and Flex items with the letters C and D, the same font size as A. Now the way baseline works is that the Flex items are aligned along the cross axis so that the text baselines of each item line up based on the largest letter, causing the smaller Flex items to adjust upward or downward to match the baseline. Now honestly, this one is a little bit niche and may seem a bit confusing, but we're going to run through all of these now inside VS Code. Alright, so I'm back inside the file we were working on in the previous chapter. I'm just going to come and update these numbers to actual text. I'll write the word banjo, high, and party. I'll refresh, and you can see the text appearing here now. Inside app.css, I'm going to go remove these width and height properties for now, as I want to just work with a regular container. And I'm going to remove flex direction column to get our flex items back in a row. And I'm also just going to remove justify content center for now. So by default, we know that our flex items will be positioned on the left. That is justify content flex start, which is the default value. Now what I want to do to really show you how align items works is for each flex item, I'm going to comment out the width and height, and I'm going to give each item a different font size. I'll give flex item 1 a font size of 90 pixels. For flex item 2, I'll comment out the width and height, and I'll give it a font size of 200 pixels. For flex item 3, comment out the width and height. Let's give it a font size of 150 pixels. And for flex item 4, comment out the width and height, and let's give it a font size of 120 pixels. So I'll refresh, and you'll see some crazy stuff going on. So what we can see is the align items default value, which is stretch, coming into play. Because our flex container has no height, the height of the flex container is being set by the tallest flex item, which in this case is this letter I. Then for the other flex items, they're being stretched the height of the flex container. So if I go add align items, stretch, you'll see nothing changes because this is the default value. Let's now have a look at the next value, flex start. Watch what happens when I refresh. The height of the flex items now only occupy the height they need, and the flex items are now positioned at the start of the cross axis. In this case, we know our row axis runs from left to right, which means that our cross axis is running from top to bottom. So the start of our cross axis is at the top. And once again, the height of the entire container is being set by this letter I, because it is the tallest flex item. If we now change this value to flex end, watch what happens. Our flex items move to the bottom, that is the end of the cross axis, because the cross axis is running from top to bottom. The next value we looked at was center, and these now center our flex items along the cross axis, that is in this case vertically. And the final one we looked at was baseline. Now I want you to keep your eye just under the letter I here, and watch how these other flex items will move downwards as if there was an invisible line running under the letter I. So I hope you saw that those letters move down slightly to be baseline with the letter I. Now the beauty with Flexbox is that it's very common to use both justify content and align items together. So let's go play around with this. I'm going to go add the justify content property, and I'm going to set it to center. But now I'm just going to comment align items out. So we know justify content will center our flex items along the main axis. That is in this case horizontally. Let's now also add align item center. I'll refresh, and you can see our flex items are also now centered along the cross axis. So our items are perfectly centered both vertically and horizontally. And of course you can use whatever values you want. Let's change this to flex end. So now our flex items are on the right of our main axis and centered vertically. Let's change align items to flex start. So now our items are aligned on the right along the main axis and at the start of our cross axis, that is at the top over here. So you can see using justify content and align items together allows a lot of flexibility to position your flex items almost anywhere you want inside your flex container. Now before we move on, I do just want to show you why I removed the fixed heights and widths from each flex item and rather let the content set the dimensions. I'm just going to remove justify content flex end. This will put our flex items back on the left. And I'm also just going to comment out align items flex start. And as we know, the default value of align items is stretch. So the content inside the flex items are stretched. Now I'm going to go change our text back to 1, 2, 3, and 4, and I'll refresh. And then I'm going to go uncomment the width and height, and then comment the font size. So now the width and height of each flex item is going to be set by the width and height I'm defining and not the content inside of it. Just to avoid boring you, I'm going to go do the other two. So now our flex items have a set width and height. I'll refresh and watch what happens. You'll notice that the flex items are no longer stretching. And that's because when you set a specific height on a flex item, it isn't possible for it to stretch. You can think of it as the height is kind of overriding the stretch value. And just to show you, if I were to uncomment this and change the value to stretch, which we know is just the default value, I'll refresh and you'll see there's no changes. But the other align items values still work. For example, if I change this to flex end, you'll see our flex items will move to the bottom. That is the end of our cross axis, which is moving from top to bottom. I can also set this to center, and you'll see that our flex items also center. And of course, just like before, we can also go add justify content and values like flex end. So I just wanted to show you that if our flex items do have a set height, you're not going to see the effect of the default value stretch on align items. And that's because the height is kind of overriding the ability for the flex item to stretch. But as you can see, other values like align item center still work. And this is the reason at the very start of this demonstration, I let the font size set the height of the containers, as I wanted to show you all the values. And if I used a fixed width and height, I wouldn't be able to do this. I know this can be a lot to take in, but honestly, don't overthink it. Most of the time, we're going to be using simple values like align item center, and for values like that, it doesn't matter whether the content is setting the height of the flex item or there is a set height. I did just want to show you this detail so you really do understand what's happening. So we've just been looking at align items when the flex container has no height. So let's now look at when the flex container does have height. When height is set on the container, there is additional space for items to move. So let's look at our 5 different values now. Align item stretch. The flex items are able just to stretch a bit more. Flex start. The flex items are at the start of the container, but compared to the diagram before, there's just a bit more space between the flex items and the bottom of the flex container. It's the same with flex end. There's now just more space vertically between the flex items and the top of the flex container. We have center, and once again, there's now more space vertically and horizontally between the flex items and the flex container, and baseline, where once again, there's just more space vertically. So let's check this out in VS Code to really see the effect. All right, so I'm going to pick up where we left off. On the flex container, I'm going to go give it some height of 800 pixels. And watch what happens to the flex items. Because our align items value is center, and our flex container now has a fixed height larger than the largest flex item's height of 300 pixels, our flex items really do look centered inside this container. Let's play with the other values. We know that stretch isn't going to work because these flex items have a fixed height. Let me quickly remove that and add the font size back in for each flex item. And to avoid boring you, I'm going to go do it for the others. Okay, I've updated all of those. I'll refresh and watch how much more these stretch because our flex container now has quite a large height on it. Let's change our align items value to flex end. You can see they now go to the bottom of the flex container. That is the end of the cross axis running from top to bottom. And the last value was baseline. I'll refresh. And once again, the numbers 1, 3, and 4 are aligning themselves on the baseline of number 2. Now, when you have a fixed height like this, using justify content and align items can give you some really cool effects. For example, let's go center both. I'll center justify content. This will center our flex items along the main axis. And let's go center align items. And as we know, this will center our flex items along the cross axis. That is from top to bottom. So you can see our flex items are perfectly centered inside this container. So let's now look at align items and shifting the main axis. When no height is set on the container, its height is the sum of flex items' heights, and justify content will have no impact. So I want to look at align items and justify content at the same time when we've shifted the main axis. If we have align items stretch, we have our flex container, our main axis, which is now running from top to bottom because we've shifted the main axis, which means that our cross axis is now moving from left to right. This means that our flex items will look like this. The default value stretch means that our flex items will now stretch the entire length of the cross axis. But because the cross axis is now running from left to right, they're being stretched horizontally. And because the height of the flex items is setting the height of the entire container, there is no space vertically, which means justify content will have no effect. For align items flex start or baseline, it'll look like this. We have our flex container, which once again has no set height. The main axis is running from top to bottom. The cross axis is running from left to right. and our flex items will look like this. They're at the start of our cross-axis, that is, on the left. And again, there is no vertical space, so any value of justify content simply will not work. Let's now look at align items flex end. We have our flex container, again with no set height. The main axis is running from top to bottom, the cross-axis from left to right, and our flex items will be positioned like this, where they're at the end of the cross-axis, that is, on the right of the container. And once again, because the height of the flex items is setting the height of the entire container, there is no vertical space. So applying any value of justify content will have no effect. The last value is align item center. Once again, we have our flex container, our main axis running from top to bottom, our cross axis running from left to right, and our flex items will be positioned like this. That is, they're centered along the cross axis, and in this case, centered horizontally. And once again, because our flex container's height is being defined by the sum of the flex item's height, there is no vertical space, so justify content will not work. Let's play around with this inside VS Code. So I'm back inside the file we were working on earlier. The first thing I'm going to do is comment out the height. I'll refresh, and then just going to remove temporarily our justify content and align items values. And then I'm going to shift the main axis by adding in the property flex direction column. So let's talk about the setup. Our flex container no longer has any fixed height, so the height of the flex container is being defined by the height of the flex items, which is the height of the different numbers. We've also shifted our main axis, so instead of running from left to right, our main axis now runs from top to bottom, which means that our cross axis is running from left to right. The default value of align items is stretch, so our flex items are stretching horizontally now along the cross axis. If I go add align items stretch, you'll see there'll be no change because stretch is the default value. Let's change this to flex start. You'll see now our flex items are on the left, that is the start of the cross axis, which is now running from left to right. For baseline, there's also no change. It's the same as flex start. Let's go change this to flex end. You'll see our flex items now move to the right because that's the end of our cross axis, which is running from left to right. And the final value we'll add is center. And this now centers our flex items along the cross axis, running from left to right. And like we discussed, any justify content value simply won't work because our main axis is running from top and bottom. Justify content spaces and aligns items along the main axis, which in this case is running top to bottom. And because there is no additional space along the main axis, none of these values will work. Let's try flex start, and you'll see there is no change. Okay, I'm just going to remove this one for now. Now, when height is set on the container, there can be additional space, so justify content will have an impact. Looking at our different cases, align item stretch, we have our flex container, which we have set a height on. We've shifted the main axis, so it's running from top to bottom. Our cross axis is running from left to right, and our flex items will look like this. They're being stretched along the cross axis. But because we've defined a height on our flex container, there now is vertical space, so justify content will have an impact. Looking at the values flex start and baseline, our flex container has a defined height. We have our main axis running top to bottom, our cross axis running left to right, and our flex items will appear at the start of the cross axis, that is on the left over here. And once again, because we've set a height on our flex container, there is now space for justify content to have an effect. The next value, flex end, we have our flex container, which has a height, our main axis top to bottom, our cross axis left to right, and our flex items will be positioned on the right, that is the end of the cross axis. And because our container has height, there's once again space for justify content to work. Looking at the last value, align item center, we have our flex container, our main axis running from top to bottom, our cross axis running from left to right, and our flex items are centered along the cross axis, that is in this case horizontally. And once again, because our flex container has height, there is vertical space for justify content to work. So let's play around with this inside VS Code. So I'm back inside this file, and the first thing I want to do is uncomment out the height. This will give our flex container a height of 800 pixels. I'm also just going to remove the align items property. So I'll refresh, And let's discuss what's happening. We have our main axis running from top to bottom, which is being set by flex direction column. Our flex container now has a fixed height of 800 pixels, which means you can see there's now space between our last flex item and the bottom of the container. And by default, we know that our flex items are going to stretch. And because we've shifted the main axis, our cross axis is now running left to right, so our flex items are stretching from left to right. Let me just explicitly add that. Align items stretch. You'll see there are no changes. But now, because we have height on our container, we can add a justify content value like center, and you'll see our flex items will center inside our container. And once again, that's because we now have a height on our flex container, and our main axis runs from top to bottom. So justify content is aligning our items along the main axis. So it's centering our items from top to bottom. Let's change align items to flex start. So you can see our flex items are now positioned on the left. That is the start of the cross axis, which is currently running from left to right, and they're vertically centered along our main axis. Let's change this to flex end. And you'll see that moves our flex items to the right. That is the end of our cross axis. And finally, let's change this to center. So now our flex items are both being centered vertically, which in this case is along our main axis. To justify content center is centering them vertically, and also centered horizontally, which is along our cross axis. So that's being centered by the align item center. So as always, I've gone into a lot of detail between when a container has height, doesn't have height, as well as shifting main axis, as I really want you to understand the details of what's happening. The good news is application in the real world is fairly simple. So let's now take a look at some align items guidance. Align items is commonly used on navigation menus and footers. Looking at this page over here, I'm going to zoom into the navigation bar. The navigation bar is a flex container. The logo on the left is a flex item. The anchor tags in the center are also flex items, and the anchor tag and button on the right are also flex items. We have our main axis running from left to right, our cross axis running from top to bottom. Along the main axis, we would be using justify content with the value like space between to set the horizontal alignment, but we'd also want these items to be vertically aligned, that is, along the cross axis. And in this case, we would want them to be centered. If we didn't do this, the different flex items would just be positioned very weirdly vertically. So I'm on the web page we just looked at. Let's go open up DevTools. We'll select the navigation bar, which you can see is a flex container. We can see we have justify content space between. If I turn that off, you'll see the flex items all just appear next to each other, whereas justify content space between nicely spaces them out. You can see the align items value is set to center. If I turn this off, you can see our logo and anchor tags move to the top, and it just looks very strange, not having all of these items vertically aligned. For the next piece of guidance, align items is often used for positioning items inside a component in a flex row. Looking at this page over here, we have a component like this, which is inside a flex container. Our text is a flex item, and our button is also a flex item. Our main axis is running from left to right. So in a row, our cross axis is running from top to bottom, and you can see that our items are positioned at the bottom of the flex container. That is, we'd be using a value like align items flex end. Another example of this is on this page over here, where we have this icon and text component at the top of the page. This would be inside a flex container. The icon would be a flex item. The text would be a flex item. Our main axis is running from left to right. Our cross axis is running from top to bottom. And we'd be using a value like align items center. So I'm on this page. Let's open up DevTools. You can see this container is a flex container, and align items is set to center. If I remove this, you'll see that they move to the top. So you'll see our flex items are no longer vertically centered, and they're just going back to the default value, which is stretch. Now, it's actually quite hard to see the stretch here because there's no background color. But if I hover over this blue, you can see the blue box is not just the height of the text, it's stretching below. Whereas when I hover over the magnifying glass, because this element is an SVG with a fixed height, which you can see in the box model here as 20 pixels, we're not going to see the effect of stretch there, like we discussed earlier, and it's just going to the start of the cross axis. So let's wrap this chapter up by adding to our summary card, justify content and align items. In this chapter, we looked at align items, which positions flex items along the cross-axis. We saw there were 5 values. Align item stretch, which was the default value. We have our container, our main axis running from left to right, which means our cross-axis is running from top to bottom. If our flex items are just content, like text, with no fixed height, the default behavior is that they'll stretch along the cross-axis. The next value was flex start. We have our flex container, our main axis running left to right, our cross-axis running top to bottom, and our flex items are now positioned at the start of the cross-axis, that is, at the top. The next value was flex end. We have our container, our main axis left to right, our cross-axis top to bottom, which means that our flex items are now positioned at the end of the cross-axis, that is, at the bottom. The next value was align item center. We have our flex container, our main axis left to right, our cross-axis top to bottom, and our flex items are now positioned in the center of the cross-axis. The last value we saw was align items baseline. We have our flex container, our main axis left to right, our cross-axis top to bottom. Our flex items had text, which in this case are different sizes, and they'll move up and down on the baseline of the largest piece of text, that is, the letter B. Now I know this was a lot to take in, and there's so many different circumstances of when your container has height, of when it has no height, when your main axis is shifted, when it's not shifted. There's just a lot going on. The truth is, in practice, it is fairly simple. There's just some common values we're going to be reaching for a lot of the time. As we've just seen in the guidance, align item center is a very common value we want to use to vertically center our flex items. So let's now go and add the align items property onto our Quill homepage. There's 2 parts of the homepage so far we've added Flexbox. The first is on the navigation bar. We have our flex container and our flex items, which is the Quill logo and our 2 buttons. Our main axis is in row, running from left to right, and we have our cross-axis running from top to bottom. Just like in the guidance we saw earlier, we want to vertically center our flex items. So let's go add this inside VS Code. So I'm back inside the app.css file. I'm going to scroll down to our nav bar. We currently have display flex and justify content space between. Now something really important I want to highlight before I go add align items is that our navigation bar has a fixed height, which we're currently defined with the variable nav height. If you don't know anything about CSS variables, you can check out my video in the description below. That height is currently set to 300 pixels. And I have a comment here, update the value in the Flexbox topic. Now, I'm not going to update it just yet. We will be changing this value in a few chapters' time when we discuss nested Flexbox. So let me scroll back down. Let's go add align item center. I'll refresh, and you'll see that our logo and buttons are now vertically centered inside the Flex container. Let's open up DevTools to see that. If I scroll down to the box model, you can see the Flex container, the nav bar, has a height of 300 pixels, which I just showed you earlier. And align items is centering the logo and the grouped buttons vertically. Now, as you can see, this does look a bit weird with such a large height and these buttons on top of each other, and we will be sorting this out soon. But we definitely want these flex items centered vertically like they are here. The next location on our page we're currently using Flexbox is in the footer. We've converted this into a flex container. We have our flex items, which is the logo, our social media icons, our anchor text, and our small text at the bottom. These are our flex items. For the footer, if you recall, we've shifted our main axis. So our main axis is running from top to bottom, which means that our cross axis is running from left to right. At the moment, our flex items are positioned on the far left, but we want to center them along our cross axis. So we're going to be using the align items value center. So let's go add this inside our project. So as I mentioned in our footer down here, our flex items are all the way on the left. Now, because we've shifted the main axis, we know it's going from top to bottom, and our cross axis is going from left to right. As we've discussed earlier, the default value of align items is stretch. Now we can't really see that going on, but if I go and select temporarily all paragraphs and give it a background color of red, you'll see that this flex item is stretching along the cross axis. And we discussed earlier that this wouldn't happen for values with fixed height and width, like our logo over here. All right, so let me just remove that. And as discussed, we want to center all these flex items. So I'm going to go grab align items and set the value to center. So this is looking great. Just a small note, our footer links, home, login, and register are still stacked vertically and are aligned left at the moment. Soon we will be correcting this and getting them into a single row. Let's continue to add to our Flexbox knowledge and learn about how to add consistent spacing between flex items using gap. We'll be discussing Flexbox and the box model and the gap property. So let's start by looking at Flexbox and the box model. Box model properties can still be used in a FlexSpot layout to control spacing. We have our flex container, our main axis currently in row running from left to right, and our cross axis running from top to bottom. And we have the following flex items in our flex container. Margin can be used to space items, and padding can be used in flex items. So using the box model properties of margin and padding can still be applied to flex items in a flex container. Let's check this out in VS Code. So I'm where we left off in the app.css file in the previous chapter. As a reminder, we have these 4 flex items, we have our flex container, and our 4 flex items over here. At the moment, the flex direction is set to column. I just want to remove that now, so our main axis defaults to row, and I'll just keep justify content center, which as we know, centers our flex items along the main axis, which currently runs left to right, and align item center, which centers our items along the cross axis, which is currently running from top to bottom. So let's go play around with some different box model properties on our different flex items. On flex item 1, let's go add a margin right of 50 pixels. So as expected, this creates 50 pixels space between 1 and 2. Let's go to flex item 3 and add a margin to all 4 sides of 100 pixels. So you'll see on the left and right, 100 pixel margin. And if we open up DevTools, we can see top and bottom has also had 100 pixels of margin applied to it. Let's go to flex item 2, and let's add a padding of 40 pixels all the way around. I'll refresh, and you'll see padding has been successfully applied. So you can still apply box model properties to your flex items. Okay, I'm just going to quickly go remove the box model properties I added. Okay, so I'm back to where I'm started. Now something which is fairly common to do is use align items and or justify content to align your flex items, but then you still want to create even space between each flex item. So to achieve this, we'd have to do something like add margin right of 50 pixels to our flex item 1, copy this, add it to flex item 2, and add it to flex item 3. So this would create equal space between our flex items that are centered horizontally and vertically. Luckily, Flexbox gives us a much easier way of doing this, and that's where the gap property comes in. Gap sets uniform spacing between flex items on the main axis. The property looks like this: gap and then a unit value. Importantly, gap is set on the flex container. In the demonstration earlier, we had to set margin right on each flex item. It's important to note that gap is set on the flex container, not the flex items. So the way it works is we have our flex container, our main axis running left to right, our cross axis, and applying gap 24 pixels on the container will space our flex items horizontally 24 pixels apart. So instead of applying multiple margin properties on flex items, we can just apply a single property, gap, on the flex container. And we can also do this when the main axis is shifted. So for example, we'll shift our main axis so it's in column. Our cross axis now runs left to right, and our flex items will now have a gap between them of 24 pixels. Because again, gap sets the spacing between flex items on the main axis. So let's play around with this inside VS Code. So I'm back inside the file we were working on just earlier. I'm going to go remove margin right from each flex item. Okay, so we're back to where we started now, with our flex items all butt up next to each other. All we're going to do is get the gap property, add a value of say 50 pixels, and voila, we have equal spacing of 50 pixels between each flex item. And of course, we can change the direction of our main axis. So we'll do flex direction column. So our main axis is now running from top to bottom, and our cross axis is running from left to right. And you can still see gap 50 pixels has been applied between each flex item. And remember, gap is equal spacing of your flex items along the main axis. So let's now take a look at some margin and gap guidance. Margin is used when you want different spacing values between flex items. On this page here, we have these two cards. Let's focus on the card on the left. This is all inside a flex container. Our main axis is in column running from top to bottom. And we have 4 flex items: this icon, the heading, paragraph, and anchor tag. Each of these flex items have different spacing values between them. So we can use margin on the flex items to achieve this desired effect of different spacing values between the flex items. Alright, so I'm on the page here. Let's open up DevTools. I've clicked on the card, which is the main flex container. You can see there's no gap property applied. But if I click on each flex item, each of these divs, you'll see this first div has a margin bottom of 32 pixels. Let's turn that off, and you'll see the spacing disappears between the icon and the heading. You'll see this piece of text here has a margin top of 8 pixels, so a different margin value than what we just saw. And finally, this anchor tag has a margin top of 32 pixels. So if I turn that off, you'll see the spacing between the text above and the anchor tag disappears. So you can use margin on each flex item if you want different spacing between your flex items. Now, gap is used when you want uniform spacing values between your flex items. For example, in the footer on this page, each column of the footer links lives inside a flex container, where each anchor tag is a flex item. We have our main axis running from top to bottom in column, and for equal spacing of say 12 pixels between each flex item, we can just use the gap property. Now, in all honesty, because of the power of the gap property, it is a lot more commonly used than using different margin values. Let's check out this application again, and I'm going to show you multiple places gap is used. I'm going to open up DevTools. I'm going to select this hero section. You can see it's a flex container, and you can see over here the gap property of 28 pixels is being applied to achieve equal spacing between all the flex items. Let's go find some more. This card over here is also a flex container, and in this case, there's only 2 flex items. We have this item here and this item here. And you'll see gap is being used at 8 pixels. Now, this is actually very common, to only have 2 flex items and then apply a gap property to space them out. Let's go look for more examples. You can see on this card over here, again, it's a flex container, and again, gap is being used to separate the 3 different flex items. Even on this major section over here, Flexbox is used to nicely align these 2 large flex items next to each other. And to create some extra space, a gap of 32 pixels is being used. And of course, like I showed in the demonstration, if I go and select the footer, you can see we have a gap of 12 pixels being used between each of the anchor tags. So it's common to use gap to create spacing between your flex items. So let's start building out our next summary card. Gap, nested flexbox, and centering. In this chapter, we looked at gap. We saw the property looked like this. Gap is applied on our flex container, and it creates spacing along our main axis. So a gap of 20 pixels applied to our flex items would look like this, where the space between each flex items is 20 pixels. So let's go ahead and add the gap property inside our Quill project. As a reminder, we're currently using Flexbox in 2 places. The first is on the navigation bar, where we have a flex container. We have our 2 flex items, the logo in the left, and the grouped anchor tags on the right. Our main axis is in row, running from left to right, and we're using the justify content space between property to space the flex items along the main axis. We have our cross axis, and we're using align item center to space the flex items vertically along the cross axis. Now, gap is used to space items along the main axis, and because these are spaced how we want them to already, that is, the logo on the left and the grouped anchor tags on the right, there's no gap or margin required on this flex container. The second place we're using Flexbox is on our footer down here. Our entire footer is a flex container, and we have 4 different flex items: the logo, our social media icons, our anchor tags, and the small text. In this layout, our main axis is in column, running from top to bottom, with our cross axis running from left to right. Now, this is a great place to use gap. We want equal spacing between each of our flex items along the main axis. So let's go add this to our project. So I'm back inside our app.css file of our Quill project. I've scrolled down to the footer, and all we need to do is add the gap property I'm going to give it a gap value of 1 rem, which in our project is 10 pixels. If you don't know anything about rem values, you can check out my video in the description below. So I'll refresh the page, and this creates a small gap of 10 pixels between each flex item. And again, just remember, the gap property is applied on the flex container, which is our footer over here. Next up, we'll explore how to create more complex layouts by combining multiple containers with nested Flexbox. We'll be discussing what is nested Flexbox and nested Flexbox guidance. So what is nested Flexbox? It is common to have a Flexbox layout inside another Flexbox layout. So looking at this page over here, this entire hero section is inside a Flex container, and the 2 buttons are also inside a Flex container. Because this Flex container is inside the other Flex container, we would call this a nested Flex container. It's nested within another Flex container. Let's check out this page in DevTools. I'll grab the hero section, and as you can see, this is a Flex container. If I expand this div, you'll see that this div down here, which is nested inside this div, is also a Flex container. So we have a Flex container inside another Flex container. So the interesting thing happening here is that for this Flex container, each of these are Flex items. And this last Flex item is also now a Flex container. So a Flex item within a Flex container can also function as a Flex container itself, allowing for multi-level Flex layouts. So looking at this in diagram form, we have our first Flex container, we have our different Flex items. We can then make one of our Flex items a Flex container. And because this Flex container is within another Flex container, we would call it a nested Flex container. And of course, this nested Flex container will have its own Flex items, shown in blue here, which we could call nested Flex items. So let's go play around with this inside VS Code. Alright, we're making great progress so far in this topic. I now want to step up our coding exercises a bit and build this simple layout using nested Flexbox, which could appear on an About Us section of a web page. Alright, so I've gone ahead and set up an index.html file with the boilerplate code and linked a style sheet called app.css, which is currently empty. Let's first go add the main blue background container. I'm going to add the div and give it a class of main container. Inside the div, I want to add our 3 different profile cards. So I'm going to do div times 3, and I'm going to give it a class of profile card. And I'll just copy this class onto the other 2 divs. So we're just going to start off nice and slow by getting our profile cards inside our main container. Let's head over to app.css. I'm going to select the main container. I'm going to give it a height of 800 pixels and a background color of light blue. So let's open up the browser and see what we have. Okay, nothing spectacular. We just have our main container with a height of 800 pixels and a light blue background. Let's now go add those 3 profile cards. I'm going to select the profile card. I'm going to give it a width of 300 pixels. I'm going to give it a height of 400 pixels. And just note, we'll later be removing this height and adding in actual content. But for now, because there is no content, we need to go and explicitly define a height so we can see our profile card. And let's give it a background color of white. I'll refresh, and our cards are now just stacked vertically on the left. I'll open up DevTools, and you can see we have our 3 cards running down the left here. So let's now go and align them using Flexbox inside our main container. All I'm going to do is come to the main container, grab the display property, and make this a Flex container. I'll refresh, and our cards are now stacked next to each other inside the main container. If I inspect this in DevTools, you can see our 3 cards over here. Now by default, we know that the main axis runs from left to right in row, and the cross axis will run top to bottom. You can also see there's space horizontally along the main axis and space vertically along the cross axis, because we've defined a fixed height on this container. So let's first go and space our profile cards along our main axis. I want even space between this, and we know that the property to use for alignment and spacing along the main axis is justify content. And I'm going to set its value to space evenly. I'll refresh, and you can see our cards are now spaced evenly along the main axis. Next up, I want these cards to be vertically centered inside our container. We know that to space Flex items along the cross axis, which is running from top to bottom, we use the property align items. And to vertically center it, I'm going to use the value center. Okay, great. This is starting to take some form. Before we start adding the content into our cards, I just want to slightly improve this by adding a border radius and giving a value of 10 pixels. So our corners are now nicely rounded. All right, I'm going to head back to index.html, and I now want to go add content inside our profile cards. The first piece of content we had was that emoji. I've just grabbed it off the web, and it's an SVG currently sitting in my clipboard. I'm just going to paste here. If you're coding along with me, I've provided links to these SVGs in the description below. So that's the profile emoji. The next element I'm going to add is an H2, which is the name of the person. The first person we had was Jane Doe. Next up, I'm going to add a paragraph tag and add their job title, which was software engineer. And then below this, we had those 3 social media icons. For now, I'm just going to add a placeholder paragraph and write the word social media icons, which we're going to come and update a bit later. So I'm now just going to copy this div and delete these 2 others and paste it once and twice. So we now have 3 cards with the same structure. Just to keep them unique, I'm going to go update this SVG to another one I have sitting in my clipboard. The second person was John Smith. Their job title was product designer. And I'm just going to leave the placeholder social media icons paragraph for now. Now, to avoid boring you, I'm just going to go update the content on our third profile card. All right, so our 3 profile cards are now inside our main container. We have our first one over here, our second one over here, and our third one over here. So let's check this out in the browser. Okay, great. Our profile cards are looking a lot better with the content in. Let's head over to app.css and now work on the profile card. The first thing you'll see is that the content is actually overflowing the card. And that's because we previously set a fixed height on the card, as we had no content. Let's now remove this, as we do have content, which will give our card height. I'll refresh, and you'll see the height of the profile card is now being set by the sum of the heights of the different elements. So let's now use Flexbox inside each profile card to better space and align the content inside here. So essentially what we're going to be doing is now making our profile card a flex container. Looking back at our HTML, currently our main container is a flex container, which means that each of these divs is a flex item. But now these flex items are also going to become their own flex containers, where the content inside these divs, that is the SVG, H2, and 2 paragraphs, will now become the flex items. So just to really highlight this main div, wrapping all the content, is a flex container. These 3 divs are each flex items of this main container, but now they're also going to become their own flex container, where the content inside of them will become flex items. We have 3 flex containers, 1, 2, and 3, inside another flex container. So all we're going to do on our profile card is add display flex. I'll refresh. Now, because the default value of flex direction is row, it now moves our flex items inside the card, which is the different pieces of content, into a row along the main axis. We don't want them positioned like this. We want them going vertically. So we need to shift the main axis by grabbing the flex direction property and adding the value column. I'll refresh, and we're kind of back to where we were before. But now our profile card is a flex container, and each of these elements is a flex item. Let's check this in DevTools. You can see this profile card is flex, and you can see those purple dashed lines appearing, signifying that this is a flex container. And once again, the main container over here is also a flex container. So our profile card is a nested flex container, because it's a flex container inside another flex container. Let's now go better align and space the content inside the profile card. Now, the spacing we see between the different elements is currently being set by default margin in the browser. If I open this up, you can see in the box model, there's default margin being applied to each of these text elements. So I'm just going to go do our mini CSS reset. I'll use the universal selector to select every element, and I'm going to go remove any default padding and any default margin. If you don't know about a CSS reset, you can check out my video in the description below. Okay, so all margin and padding has been removed from the page. Now, because our main axis inside the profile card is running from top to bottom, and I'd like to achieve equal spacing between each of these elements, I'm going to use the gap property. and I'll set its value to 20 pixels. If you recall from earlier, the gap property sets equal spacing between flex items along the main axis. And once again, in our profile card, the main axis is running from top to bottom. So we get equal vertical spacing between each of our elements. Let's check this out in DevTools. You can see that hatched purple is an equal spacing of 20 pixels. The last thing I want to do is horizontally center each of our elements. Now, once again, our main axis is running from top to bottom, which means our cross axis is running from left to right. And we know for spacing and alignment along the cross axis, we use the align items property. So I'm going to grab align items. I'm going to set its value to center. And this will nicely center all our content. Now, before we handle our social media icons, I want to just go add a bit of padding to our card. As it's looking a bit cramped, let's give it a value of 20 pixels. Okay, that just creates a bit of extra space inside our card. So let's now go tackle the social media icons. I'm back inside the index.html file. I'm now going to go replace this paragraph with a div. And inside the div, I'm going to add 3 SVGs that are currently sitting in my clipboard and I've just grabbed from the web. If you are coding along with me, I've also provided links to these SVGs in the description below. Okay, so we have our 3 social media icons here, which are contained within a div. Now these icons are identical for the other cards. So I'm just going to go remove the paragraph here, add in the content there, remove the paragraph here, and add in the content here. All right, so let's check this out in the browser. All right, this is looking pretty good as it is. The SVGs appear nicely next to each other like this because by default, they're inline elements. And inline elements do not start on a new line. Now, what I would like to do though, is have better control of spacing and alignment of these SVGs by converting this div container into a flex container. So effectively, we're now going to have 3 levels of Flexbox. Our first level is the main container, which contains 3 flex items, the 3 different profile cards, this one here, and this one here. We know that our profile card are also flex containers, where the flex items are the SVG, the H2, the paragraph, and now this div. And we're now going to go convert this flex item, this div, into its own flex container, which means that each of these SVGs will be flex items of this flex container. Now I need to add a class to this div, and I'm going to call it social icons. I'm going to copy this and just add it to our other div containers for the social media icons. In app.css, I'm now going to go select the social icons, and we're going to convert this into a flex container by adding display flex. I'll refresh, and you'll see not much changes. Our SVGs are still positioned horizontally next to each other because by default, our flex items, that is the SVGs, are in row because the main axis runs from left to right by default. But just to show you that this now is a flex container, if I go add flex direction and set this to column, you'll see our social media icons will appear one below each other. Okay, I'm just going to remove this. And the only thing I actually want to do on the social media icons is create equal spacing between them. I'm going to use the gap property, which we know sets equal spacing between flex items along the main axis. And I'm just going to set this value to 10 pixels. All right, before we check out our masterwork and expand the browser full screen, I've realized this emoji isn't correct. I'm going to go just update that in the HTML. All right, great. I've just updated that emoji. So let's go check out our beautiful work. All right, this looks fantastic. We've now built a simple section of a web page, and we've used 3 different levels of Flexbox. Opening up DevTools, we have our main container, which is a flex container. Each of these profile cards are flex items of this main container. We then made these profile cards their own flex containers to space and align the content inside the card. Inside the profile card, it has the flex items of an SVG, an H2, a paragraph, and a div. And then this flex item, the div, we also converted to a flex container, which has 3 SVGs. So in this demonstration, we've nested Flexbox twice. Anyways, I hope this was a bit of fun and is able to also help consolidate a lot of the other properties we've been learning about so far. So let's now take a look at some nested Flexbox guidance. Nested Flexbox is commonly used on navigation menus and footers. Looking at this page over here, I'm going to zoom into the navigation bar. All of the content in the navigation bar is inside a flex container in purple. We have 2 flex items, On the left, we have our logo, which is a flex item, and all the anchor tags on the right are also grouped as a flex item. We would then use a property like justify content space between to space these two flex items. I'm now going to zoom in on the flex item on the right. This flex item would also become a flex container. So this is now a nested flex container. And we then have our different flex items inside this nested flex container. So let's check this out in the browser. So I'm on this page. I'm going to open up DevTools. I'm going to select the navigation bar. You can see that this is a flex container. I'm going to expand the HTML. You can see we have a div on the left and a div on the right, our two flex items. You can see this flex item on the right is also a flex container and contains these flex items over here. So a navigation bar is a very common use case of using nested Flexbox. Looking at the next piece of guidance, nested Flexbox is also commonly used in sections and components. Looking at this page over here, the entire hero section would be a flex container. The heading, paragraph text, and buttons are our flex items. I'm going to zoom in on the buttons. This would now be a nested flex container, and our two buttons would be the nested flex items. So let's check this out in DevTools. You can see we have our flex container here. If I expand it out, we have a div with our buttons, which is also a flex container. So nesting flex containers inside other flex containers is very common. So let's wrap up by adding to our summary card, gap, nested Flexbox, and centering. In this chapter, we looked at nested Flexbox. We saw that we can have a flex container with flex items, and that we can convert flex items into their own flex containers, which is known as a nested flex container. The nested flex container has its own flex items, which we can refer to as nested flex items. So let's go and use nested Flexbox on our Quill homepage. If you recall, we're currently using Flexbox in two locations. We have a flex container around our navigation bar, which currently has two flex items, the logo on the left and the anchor tags on the right. And we're using the justify content space between value to create space between these two flex items. We're now going to go add Flexbox onto the flex item on the right. I'm going to zoom in on our anchor tags. This will now become a nested flex container, which will contain the flex items, the two anchor tags, which we can refer to as nested flex items. So let's go code this up. So just a reminder of what our navbar currently looks like. The navbar over here is a Flexbox. And if we go look at the HTML markup, this flex container has two flex items. The logo on the left and the unordered list contains two list items, which are the two anchor tags. We're going to go convert this flex item, so we'll end up with a nested flex container. To do this, we need to go add a class, which I'm going to call nav button container. Back inside app.css, I'm going to select this class, nav button container, and let's go convert this into a flex container by changing the display property to flex. I'll refresh. And finally, we have our anchor tags next to each other. Now, because by default, we know that our main axis is running from left to right in row, we can add a small gap value to create space between our flex items, the anchor tags. I'm going to add a value of 2 rem. All right, so this navigation bar is looking a lot better. Now, something we did earlier on the course was actually add temporarily quite a high height value onto the navigation bar. It's being controlled by this variable nav height. And if we scroll up, we can see that's currently set at 300 pixels. If I open up DevTools and select the nav container, you can see it's quite big. Now that we've aligned our buttons next to each other, we can go reduce the height of this. I'm going to go change this to 100 pixels. Now, this looks pretty bad. Let's open up DevTools and see what's going on. Because previously the height was 300 pixels, it was creating a lot of white space between the navigation bar and the hero section below it. Now, earlier on in this project, I previously had some margin bottom applied to our navigation bar to create some white space between it and the top of the hero section. However, I'm not going to go add that on, because in the next chapter, we're actually going to use Flexbox to center this entire hero section. So we're just going to have to live with this for a little bit longer. But this has been very successful. Our navigation bar is complete and looking really great. And you can see the power of using nested Flexbox. Now I'm going to scroll down the page, and the next location we're using Flexbox is on our footer over here. where at the moment our social media icons and anchor tags are being stacked vertically. So we're now going to be using nested Flexbox to correct this. Our entire footer is a Flex container. We have the logo, the grouped social media icons, the grouped anchor tags, and the small text as Flex items inside the Flex container. I'm going to zoom in to the social media icons and anchor text. The anchor text is now going to become a Flex container, and because this is inside another Flex container, we can call it a nested Flex container. Each anchor tag will be a Flex item, so we can refer to these as nested Flex items. And for the social media icons, and because this is inside the parent Flex container, it too is a nested Flex container. The Flex items of this container are each social media icon, which again we can refer to as nested Flex items. So let's go code this up. Okay, so I've scrolled down to the footer class where we're displaying Flexbox. Let's go look at the HTML markup. I'll scroll down to the footer. Here's that class. The footer semantic HTML element is the Flex container, and the Flex items inside this container are the logo, the social media icons, which live inside an unordered list, the anchor tags, which also live inside an unordered list, and the paragraph, which is the small text. So we're now going to convert this unordered list to become its own Flex container, and this unordered list to also be its own Flex container. To do this, we need to go add a class here. I'm going to call this social icons container. And for the anchor tags, I'm going to add a class and call it footer links container. All right, let's head to app.css. In the footer section of the CSS, underneath the footer class, I'm going to first go select the social icons container. We're going to set the display property to flex. I'll refresh, and you can see these icons now nicely appear next to each other in a row. As our main axis is running from left to right, we can use the gap property to create some space between our Flex items. I'm going to set a gap value of 1.5 rem. Now for our anchor tags, we'll go and grab that container, which was footer links container. We're going to change this to a Flex container by adding the display flex property. I'll refresh, and you can see our anchor tags now appear next to each other. And again, because the main axis is in row, we can use the gap property to create some space, which I'm going to just set as 1 rem. I'll refresh, and voila, our footer is now looking beautiful. And once again, this is a nested Flex container. Opening up DevTools, I'll select the footer, which you can see is a Flex container. I'll expand the footer. You can see the 4 different Flex items, the anchor tag, the unordered list, and the paragraph. And for 2 of these Flex items, the 2 unordered lists, we've converted those to become their own Flex containers. It's now time to master one of the most common tasks in layout design, horizontally and vertically centering. We'll be discussing centering with Flexbox, the different horizontal centering methods, the different vertical centering methods, and traditional centering methods versus Flexbox. Now this chapter is getting my more difficult stem. When I first started out, I found it a bit conceptually difficult to know when to apply different centering methods. So hopefully in this chapter, I've done a good job for you in setting out all the different ways we can center elements and the best use cases for each. Now, as a heads up, this chapter is one of the longer ones, as I do go into a lot of detail, but it is my goal that you walk away confident with centering in CSS. So let's first talk about centering in the context of Flexbox. Flexbox offers a modern and flexible approach to centering items vertically and horizontally. Looking at this page over here, we have a hero section which would all be inside a Flex container. Our Flex items would be the heading, the paragraph text, and the 2 buttons. Our main axis is in column, running from top to bottom, which means our cross-axis is running from left to right. Using Flexbox allows us to easily center our items horizontally along the cross-axis. So I'm on this page we just looked at. I'm going to open up DevTools. I'm going to select the hero section. You can see that this is a Flex container. You can see the Flex direction is set to column, which means the main axis is running from top to bottom. So our cross-axis is running left to right. And the align items property center is being used to horizontally center these Flex items. If I turn this off, you'll see they move to the left. So here's an example of Flexbox allowing us to center items very simply. Looking at another example, we have these cards over here. At the top of the card is an image, and this image sits inside a Flex container, where the image is the Flex item in green. Our main axis runs from left to right, our cross-axis from top to bottom, and we're using Flexbox to both easily center this image vertically, as well as centering it horizontally. So I'm on the same page as before. I'm just going to scroll down to that section. So you can see over here, that image we just looked at. I'm going to select it. You can see it's inside a Flex container over here. And you can see both Justify Content and Align Item Center have been applied. I'll turn Justify Content Center off. Again, our main axis is running from left to right. So if I turn this off, you'll see it moves to the left, or Flex Start by default. And for Align Item Center, if I turn that off, you'll see by default, our image stretches because the default value of Align Items is stretch. Because the Flex container has a height set of 240 pixels, we can center the image. As you can see, there's space above and below for the image to move. So Flexbox offers a really neat way to center items horizontally or vertically, and horizontally and vertically. So I'm now going to be taking a detailed look at all the different methods available to us for centering elements. We're going to start by looking at horizontally centering a container. Now there are two methods available to us for centering elements. The first is using box model properties, where margin can be applied left and right to horizontally center child containers. To achieve this, we'd use the margin property, set the top and bottom value to 0, and the left and right value to auto. In diagram form, we'd have our browser, we'd have a parent container shown in purple, and our child container would nicely be centered inside the parent container, with equal margin applied left and right. It's important to note that the margin property is applied on the child container. So let's play around with this inside VS Code. So I've gone ahead and created an index.html file and linked a style sheet which is currently empty. What I'm going to do in the HTML is add a div. I'm going to give this a class of parent container, and I'll add another div and give this the class of child container. Inside this div, I'm also just going to go add some lorem text, just so we have some content. We'll head over to app.css. I'm first going to use the universal selector to just reset all the box model properties. I'll add a padding of 0 and a margin of 0. Next up, I'm going to select the parent container. And just so we can see it, I'm going to give it a background color of light blue. I'll select the child container. I'll give it a background color of blue. Let's give it a height of 300 pixels and a width of 300 pixels. So let's check this out so far in the browser. So you can see in blue here, our child container, which is inside our parent container in light blue. So using box model properties, let's go center this horizontally. As we saw earlier, we'll add a margin. We'll set the top and bottom value to 0 and the left and right value to auto. Let's refresh. And you can see this nicely centers our child container inside our parent container with equal spacing applied left and right. So let's now see how we can achieve the same thing using Flexbox. Flexbox properties make it simple to horizontally center flex items. We can use the Justify Content Center property when our main axis is in row. Remember, by default, our main axis is in row, which is horizontal, so we can apply Justify Content Center. But if we've shifted our main axis, so that's in column, we'd have to use Align Item Center to horizontally center our flex item. So Align Item Center is when our main axis is in column. Looking at this in diagram form, we have our browser, our flex container, our flex item. For this demonstration, I am going to put our main axis into column so that our main axis is running from top to bottom and our cross axis is running from left to right. So to horizontally center our flex item, we would apply Align Item Center as our main axis is in column, and Align Items is for centering along our cross axis, which is going horizontal. Now this works even when our flex container doesn't have a set width, and that's because the flex container is most likely a block element, which by default will extend the full width of the page. So even if there is no width set on the flex container, it will have width, which means that there's space horizontally for the flex item to move. It's also important to note that the Flexbox properties, Justify Content and Align Items, are applied on the flex container. This is different to the box model, where margin was applied on the child container. So let's play around with this inside VS Code. So I'm back inside app.css. I'm going to just comment margin 0 auto out. I'll refresh, and our child container moves back to the left. So let's go use Flexbox to center our child item. We do that by going onto the parent container. We give it the display property with the value flex. For this demonstration, I'm going to change our flex direction to column, which means our main axis is now running from top to bottom, and our cross axis is running from left to right. So to horizontally center our flex item, we're going to grab the align items property and set its value to center. I'll refresh, and you'll see our child item centers horizontally inside our flex container. And once again, this works because our parent container has width, which is currently the width of the browser. If I click on the parent container, you see it currently has a width of around 1100 pixels. So because the container has width, there is space for our flex item to move horizontally. So let's now continue our discussion of horizontal centering by looking at horizontal centering content inside a container. Looking at the box model first, using padding to create internal space left and right gives the illusion that content inside a container is centered. So we could use the property padding, set the top and bottom value to 0, and the left and right value to something like 200 pixels. Looking at this in diagram form, we have our browser, our parent container, our child container, and applying a padding value of 200 pixels left and right would add on extra space like this on the left and right of the child element. This would effectively give the illusion that the content inside the child container has been centered, especially if there's something like background color applied on the child container, as background color will both be applied on the content itself and any padding. The padding property is applied on the child container. So let's play around with this inside VS Code. So I'm back inside app.css. I'm going to just go comment out all the Flexbox stuff, and I want to uncomment out margin. So now we're back to horizontally centering our entire child container using box model properties. Let's now go add some padding. I'm going to give it a value of 0, top and bottom, and 200 pixels left and right. I'll refresh, and you can see by adding padding left and right, it gives the illusion that our content is centered inside the child container. If I open up DevTools and select the element and go down to the box model, you can see our child container is here with the content inside, and padding of 200 pixels has been applied left and right. I've just kept margin here to keep the whole thing centered, and let me just comment that out. And ignoring the parent container for a second, you can see on the child container, it still appears as if our content has been centered inside the blue box. So looking now at Flexbox, box model properties still apply on flex items, so padding still can be used to create internal horizontal space. So in terms of horizontally centering content inside a container, we can still use the padding property from the box model. Looking in diagram form, we have our browser, our flex container, our flex item, our main axis running top to bottom, our cross axis running left to right, and padding is simply just applied onto the flex item, creating internal horizontal space. And like with the box model, the padding is applied on the flex item, that is, the child container. So when adding padding, what effectively is happening is that the content inside the container is centered. So unlike before, where we were centering the actual container using margin or Flexbox properties, we're just using padding to create extra space, which gives the illusion that our element is being centered. So let's go play around with this inside VS Code. So I'm just going to comment out the box model properties on the child container, and I'm going to uncomment out the flex properties. This gives us our flex item in blue, horizontally centered inside our parent container. I'm now going to come and uncomment the padding property. I'll refresh, and you can see padding has been applied onto our flex item, again giving the illusion like the content inside of it has been centered. So let's now continue our discussion by looking at vertically centering a container. For this to work, our parent container has to have a set height. Now, when we looked at horizontally centering a container, I stressed the idea that this works because the parent container does have a width, as block elements extend the full width of the page. Looking now vertically, if we don't set a height on our parent container, it means that the height of the parent container is being set by the height of the child container, which means that there's no space for our child container to move vertically. So looking first at how we can achieve this with box model, there actually is no easy way to vertically center a child container inside a parent container with a set height. So we have our browser, our parent container, our child container. Our parent container has a set height, and there is no easy way to vertically center the child container inside a parent container with a set height. So let's now look at Flexbox. Flexbox properties make it simple to vertically center flex items when the parent container has a set height. We would use align item center when the main axis is in row. If the main axis is in row, it means our cross axis is in column, and the cross axis is how we vertically center. and we know that align items is used on the cross-axis. We would use justify content center if the main axis is in column. We know that justify content is used on the main axis, and if the main axis is in column, which is vertical, we would use justify content to center it. Looking at this in diagram form, we have our browser, our flex container, our flex item. Following on from the diagrams we've looked at before, we put our main axis in column, so it's going from top to bottom, which means our cross-axis is going from left to right. As our flex container has a set height, we can easily use the justify content center property to center this along the main axis, which in this setup is responsible for vertical positioning, as our main axis is running from top to bottom. And just like we saw before, our flex properties are applied on the flex container. Now by doing this, the actual container is centered. It's not like we're using padding to create the illusion the child container is centered. It is actually centered inside the parent container. So let's go check this out in VS Code. Okay, so this is where we left off. I'm just going to go remove the padding for now. I'll refresh. And as I mentioned, for this to work, we need our parent container to have a set height, which needs to be more than the height of the child container, which is currently 300 pixels. So let's go give our parent container a height of 800 pixels. I'll refresh, and you can see now there is now vertical space for our flex item to move up and down. As we know, the flex direction is column, which means our main axis is running from top to bottom. So we're going to use the property justify content and set its value to center. And this centers our flex item vertically. It's also centered horizontally because before we had align items set to center. So this is a good example of centering a flex item both horizontally and vertically, using align item center and justify content center. And very importantly, for this to work, our parent container has to have a height bigger than the height of the child container, so there is space for the flex item to move vertically. We don't need a set width on the parent container, because for a block element like a div, it will extend the full width of the page, so it has a width. So let's now look at the final case of vertical centering content inside a container. This is used when the parent container has no set height. So before, our parent container had set height. Now our parent container doesn't have set height. Looking at the box model, padding can be applied to the top and bottom of the child container. So it's the exact same as the horizontal centering content inside a container we looked at earlier. But now we're just applying padding to the top and bottom. We would apply a property like padding with the top and bottom value set to 200 pixels and the left and right value set to 0. Looking at this in diagram form, we have our browser, our parent container, our child container, and because our top and bottom value of padding is 200 pixels, there's 200 pixels being applied above our child container and below our child container. Now you will note the child container is also centered horizontal, so there's also padding applied left and right. On the slides, I just want to focus on the padding applied top and bottom. And just like with horizontal padding, the padding property is applied on the child container. So let's go play around with this inside VS Code. So I'm going to go comment out our Flexbox properties, and I'm also going to comment out the height, as we want to be looking at a parent container which has no height. I'm now going to add back in our margin and padding properties from earlier. So I'll refresh, and we're back to the situation where our content has padding, giving the illusion that it's horizontally centered, and our entire content container has been centered inside the parent container. So all I'm going to do is change the 0 value here, which is currently controlling padding applied top and bottom, to now have a value of 200 pixels. I'll refresh, and you'll see our element now appears to be centered left and right and top and bottom. I'll open up DevTools. I'll select the child container, and you can see the child container in here with padding of 200 pixels all the way around. So let's now look at Flexbox. Now, because the parent container has no height, we can't use Flexbox properties like justify content and align items. But box model properties still apply on flex items, so padding can be used to create internal vertical space. So again, we'd apply a property like padding with the value of 200 pixels top and bottom and 0 left and right. In diagram form, we have our browser, our flex container, our flex item, our main axis is running from top to bottom, our cross axis from left to right, and by applying padding, we've effectively created internal space between the child container and the parent container of 200 pixels, both top and bottom. And the padding value is applied on the flex item. Now, both these methods is when content inside the container is centered. This is different to what we looked at before with vertical centering, using align items and justify content, because in those cases, the actual container is being centered inside the parent. Using padding just creates internal space, effectively centering the content, and ultimately giving the illusion that the container has been centered. So let's play around with this inside VS Code. So I'm just going to comment out the box model properties, and I'm going to go uncomment the Flexbox properties. I'll refresh, and we're back to having our flex item horizontally centered. Just to build this up slowly again, let's go add padding of 0, top and bottom, and 200 pixels left and right. I'll refresh. This creates internal horizontal space left and right of our child container. Let's now go update the top and bottom value from 0 to 200 pixels. I'll refresh, and you'll see now that our child container appears to be centered vertically. Opening up DevTools, selecting the child container, I'll zoom out a bit, and you can see our child container now appears to be centered both horizontally and vertically. All right, that was a lot to take in. I'm sure you're feeling pretty overwhelmed with the different methods of centering available to us. So let's now go through each of them one by one and start gaining some centering guidance so we can get a better idea which methods are used where. To do this, I'm going to slowly start building up this table where I've got the columns box model and flexbox next to each other. And for the rows, I'm going to be going through the 4 different cases we looked at. We'll first start with horizontally centering a container. This is when we're actually centering the child container horizontally within the parent container. With box model properties, we achieve that by applying a margin of 0 top and bottom and auto left and right, which centers the child container inside the parent container. This method is used to center main page containers and sometimes regular content containers. So let's now take a look at some examples of this by looking at horizontal centering guidance. Margin is often used to establish a web page's main container, as it is a simple method for horizontal centering. If you don't know anything about main page containers, you can check out my video in the description below. Looking at this page here, as we know, our entire page is wrapped by a body tag in HTML. All the content we see on the page would be wrapped within a main container, which would often just be a div tag. To center the main container, we would use the margin property. So this is a common example of where we would use margin to horizontally center a child container. That is, the main container of a web page. Let's check out this page in DevTools. All right, so I'm going to go open up DevTools. And you can see over here, we have a div with the class hero container. I'll click it, and you can see in orange, left and right, that margin has been applied. Let's scroll down to the box model, where we can see currently a margin of 253 pixels has been applied left and right, which horizontally centers all the content within the page. If I scroll up, we can see margin left of auto and margin right of auto has been applied. This is the same thing as doing margin 0 top and bottom and auto left and right. They've just done it as 2 separate declarations. And just to show you that this is in fact centering all the content, if I turn them both off, you'll see all the content moves to the left. So using margin is a very common approach to horizontally centering your entire page. Now, using margin to horizontally center is also sometimes used for regular content containers. For example, on this page, we have our body tag, we have our main container, which we've seen is centered by using margin, but we can also use margin a second time inside the main container to center elements like this card. This card, which is a content container, would be inside something like a div, and the margin property is being applied both to the main container and to the content container. So let's go check this out. So I'm on this page. I'll open up DevTools. I'm going to select the main container over here. Going down to the box model, you can see it currently has a margin of 160 pixels left and right. And this establishes the main page container. That is, the wrapper around all the content on the page. If I go select this card, you'll see it too has margin applied left and right, effectively centering the entire card. And you can see the margin property over here is actually one of the uncommon ones used, where 4 rems has been applied to the top, auto has been applied left and right, and 2 rems has been applied on the bottom. So this is an example of using margin twice, on the main page container and also on a regular content container like a card. So let's now take a look at guidance on horizontally centering a container using Flexbox. As we've seen from the demonstrations earlier, depending on the orientation of the main axis, we can use justify content center or align item center. Flexbox is used to horizontally center regular content containers. Now I know we just looked at centering a regular content container using margin, but using Flexbox is a lot more common, because Flexbox is a much more powerful way of handling alignment and spacing of items, which you just can't achieve with margin. So continuing on with our horizontal centering guidance, Flexbox properties make it simple to horizontally center regular content containers. Looking at this example, this hero section would be inside a flex container. We have our flex items, which are the heading, this paragraph text, and the 2 buttons. Our main axis would be in column, going from top to bottom, and our cross axis would be going left to right. Because our cross axis is horizontal, we would use the align items property to center our flex items horizontally. So using Flexbox on regular content containers, like inside this hero section, is very common. Let's go check out this page. I'll open up DevTools. I'll select the container, which you can see is a Flexbox. You can see the flex direction is set to column, so our main axis is going top to bottom, and align items is set to center. I'll turn this off, and you can see some of our elements go to the left. So by applying align item center, we're centering all of our flex items horizontally. I'm going to scroll down the page to show you another example of where Flexbox is used on a regular content container. We saw this example earlier with these images. I'll open up DevTools, select the container. You can see we have our flex container. In this case, our main axis is going from left to right, so justify content center is being used to center the image inside the flex container. So long story short, Flexbox is a very common method used for centering items inside a regular container, and is much more commonly used than what we saw just before, where margin was used to center this regular content container. So continuing to add to our table, let's now look at horizontally centering content inside a container. To do this, we use the padding property, where we can set 0 for top and bottom and something like 200 pixels for left and right. This is used for creating equal horizontal space around content inside a container. Once again, the content is not actually centered, but extra space is now around the content, giving the illusion that it looks centered. And because box model properties work on flex containers, this is both a method we can use on regular div containers and flex containers. So padding is used to create equal internal space left and right around containers like cards and elements like anchor tags. Let's see this in action on this page here. This content, the heading, paragraph, and anchor tags, are all contained inside a div. It's a regular content container. Now to create horizontal space around this content, padding has been applied. So it gives the illusion that this content has been centered. The same thing is happening with the buttons. I'll zoom in. We have our anchor tags, which are in red. And again, some horizontal padding has been applied to give the illusion that the content, the anchor tag, is being centered. So let's check this out in the browser. So I'll open up DevTools. Let's first look at this content container. You can see over here, it's just a regular div. There's no flex, so this isn't a flex container. It's a regular div. But you can see straight away all the green around it. I'll scroll down to the box model. You can see the content and the 64 pixel padding that's been applied left and right to create horizontal spacing. You can see the padding property here of 4 rems is being applied to all 4 sides. Let's go check out the anchor tag. Scrolling down to the box model, you can see the anchor tag over here in blue and the padding of 15 pixels left and right. Once again, the content has been centered, and because of the padding, it appears as if the anchor text has been centered left and right. So let's now look at how we can use padding inside Flexbox. Padding can be used to create equal internal space left and right on flex containers. Looking at an example, we have all this content inside a flex container, and because box model properties still apply, we can add padding left and right to give the illusion that this content has been centered. Let's go check this page out. I'll open up DevTools. I'll select the container. You can see over here the word flex. So this is a flex container. And you can see looking at box model properties, 60 pixels of padding has been applied left and right. So padding can be applied to regular div containers or flex containers, again, giving the illusion that the content has been centered. So once again, we're not actually centering the content, We're just applying some padding to make it look centered. This is very different to what we looked at before, where in this flex container, we actually are centering the flex items using the align items property. So let's now start looking at centering guidance for vertical containers. We'll first be looking at vertically centering a container. If you recall, this is the case when our container had a set height on it. We saw that trying to use box model properties, there is no easy way to achieve this. With Flexbox, we can use justify content center or align item center, depending on the orientation of the main axis. And this method is used to vertically center regular content containers. So let's take a look in detail at the vertical centering guidance. Flexbox properties are often used to vertically center UI elements inside a flex container that has a set height. Looking at this page, I'm going to zoom into the icons towards the left of the page. Looking at the middle icon, all of this content would be inside a flex container. Our flex item is the icon itself. The main axis is in row going from left to right, the cross axis in column going from top to bottom, and the container has a set height. This easily allows us to vertically center this icon using Flexbox properties. So let's check this out in the browser. So I'm going to open up DevTools. I'm going to select this flex container. You can see Flexbox has been activated. And if I open up the div, you can see there's one flex item, which is just the SVG, the icon. Looking at the container properties, because there's no flex direction property set, it means our main axis is horizontal and our cross axis is vertical. This means that align item center is controlling the vertical alignment of our SVG. If I turn that off, you'll see the SVG moves to the top. So align items is vertically centering the flex item, which is the icon, inside the flex container. And the flex container has a set height of 48 pixels. And if I hover over the icon, you can see it has a height of 25 pixels. This means that there's space for the icon to move up and down. This flex item is actually being both horizontally and vertically centered. Justify content center is centering the flex item horizontally. If I turn that off, you'll see it moves to the left. And turning align items off moves the flex item to the top. So you can see when our container has a set height, it's very easy to vertically and horizontally center the flex item with Flexbox properties. So let's now look at the last case, which is vertically centering content inside a container. For both box model and Flexbox, we use the padding property, where we would set a value like 200 pixels top and bottom, and 0 left and right. This is used for creating equal vertical space around content inside a container. Now, just like horizontally centering content inside a container, we are once again adding internal space to give the illusion that the content has been centered. We're not actually centering the content or container, like we just saw with Flexbox properties, justify content and align items. So padding is used to create equal internal space, top and bottom, around containers like cards and elements like anchor tags. Looking at the same page we looked at earlier when we spoke about horizontally centering content inside a container, we have our container around all the content, and padding has been applied top and bottom. If I zoom in on the anchor tags, the content is the anchor tag itself, and padding again has been applied top and bottom. So let's check out this page again in the browser. So I'm going to open up DevTools. I'm going to select the container. Once again, you can see it's a div. There is no flex, so it's just a regular content container. If I scroll down, you can see padding of 64 pixels has been applied top and bottom, as well as left and right. So it appears that this content is vertically centered, but in actual fact, we've just created internal space using padding. If I click the anchor tag, you can also see once again, padding has been applied top and bottom and left and right. So this is fairly common, applying padding to elements or containers, both horizontally and vertically, to create internal space to improve the visual aesthetic of the element or container. Now, padding can also be used to create equal internal space, top and bottom, on flex containers. Looking at this page once again, we have our flex container wrapping all the content, and padding has been applied top and bottom to create internal space to give the illusion that this regular content container has been centered. Looking at this inside the browser, let's open up DevTools. I'll select the container, which you can see is a flex container, and scrolling down on the box model, you can see padding of 40 pixels has been applied top and bottom. And as we saw earlier in this example, padding of 60 pixels has been applied left and right. Once again, creating internal space to give the illusion that this regular content container has been centered. So let's wrap up by finishing off the summary card, gap, nested flexbox, and centering. In this chapter, we looked at centering. I'm going to be summarizing this all inside this table, where we have our methods for centering, box model and flexbox in the columns, and our rows are the different cases. Looking at horizontally centering a container using the box model, we achieve this with margin, setting 0 top and bottom, and auto left and right. We have our browser, our parent container, and our child container, which is horizontally centered because of the auto value left and right. For Flexbox, we can use the Flexbox property justify content center. This would be used where inside our browser, we have a flex container, our flex item, our main axis in row running from left to right, and our cross axis going from top to bottom. Justify content with the value center is used in this case because our main axis is horizontal. If our main axis had been shifted so that it was in column, you would use a line item center. Moving on to horizontal centering content inside a container, we would use padding, would set 0 top and bottom, and a value like 200 pixels left and right. We have our browser, our parent container, and our child container. Adding padding left and right creates internal space, giving the illusion that the content inside the container has been centered. And we saw this was commonly used on elements like cards and anchor tags. Because box model properties can apply on flex containers and flex children, we can do the exact same thing. Apply a padding like this. We have our browser, our flex container, our flex child. Again, our main axis is in row, and our cross axis is going top to bottom. Applying the padding creates internal space left and right on the child container, giving the illusion that the content inside the flex item has been centered. Moving on to the next case, where we're vertically centering a container. And if you remember, this is when the parent had a set height. Using box model properties, there is no easy way to achieve this. With Flexbox, for our setup, where our main axis is in row and our cross axis is going from top to bottom, we would use the align item center property. We have our browser, our flex container, which has a set height, and our flex item will be centered. Our main axis running left to right, and our cross axis running top to bottom. And because align items is used for positioning flex items along the cross axis, it's horizontally centered as the cross axis is vertical. The last case is vertically centering content inside a container. And this is commonly used when the parent has no height. On a standard container or element, we would apply padding like this, where a value like 200 pixels has been applied top and bottom. We have our browser, our parent container, and our child container, which has padding applied above and below, giving the illusion that the content inside the child container has been centered. We can also apply padding on a flex container or flex item. So we'd apply padding the same way we just did. We have our browser, our flex container, our flex item, where the main axis is in row, the column axis is top to bottom, and applying the padding would create internal space above and below the flex item, giving the illusion that the content inside the container is centered. Now, I know this was a lot to take in, but I do hope I have provided a comprehensive overview of how elements and containers are centered in CSS. So let's now go look at applying different centering methods on our Quill homepage. Earlier on in this project, I already set up the main page container using margin. We have our body tag in red, and we have a main container shown in blue containing all the content, and we're using margin to horizontally center this container. Let's check this out inside VS Code. So you can see in our CSS file, we have this container where we're using margin, 0, and auto left and right to horizontally center all our content. Let's check this out in DevTools. I'll select this div where the class container is being applied, scroll down to the box model, and you can see margin has been applied left and right with those orange lines horizontally centering our entire container. And as we saw in the guidance, this is a very common practice, using margin to horizontally center your main container. Let's now go see how we can use Flexbox in two other places on our page for centering. We're going to be using Flexbox on our hero section. We're going to be converting the entire hero section into a flex container. This flex container actually has a height set. I set this height earlier on in the project where the hero section is using view height units, so it always appears above the fold in your browser. If you don't know about view height units, you can check out my video in the description below. The flex items inside this flex container will be the heading, the paragraph, and the anchor tags. To ensure these flex items stack vertically, we need our main axis to run from top to bottom. that is, in column. We'll then use the justify content property to vertically center our flex items inside the flex container. Our cross-axis is running from left to right, which means that we can use the align items property to horizontally center our flex items. So let's go do this inside VS Code. I'm going to scroll down to the hero section in our CSS file, and just a quick recap on the current setup of this. I'm going to open up DevTools, and I'm going to select the hero section. As I mentioned earlier, the hero section has a set height, which is 100 view height units minus the height of the navigation bar. You can see here I'm using a CSS function to define the height. If you don't know how to use CSS functions, you can check out my video in the description below. If I scroll down in DevTools to the box model, you can see at the moment the height is 939 pixels. And if I reduce the height of my browser, the height of the hero section would reduce. Now the main takeaway point here is that our hero section does have height, which means that we can easily vertically center our flex items, which is the heading, the paragraph, and the grouped anchor tags inside this unordered list. So let's go to our hero section. Let's convert the entire hero section into a flex container. So we'll add display flex. I'll refresh, and you can see our flex items are now next to each other because the main axis is running from left to right. Let's shift the main axis so it goes from top to bottom. We'll grab flex direction and set its value to column. I'll refresh. You can see we're back to where we started, but this is now a flex container with flex items. Let's first vertically center our flex items using the justify content property. We're using justify content because our main axis is running from top to bottom. So we'll set justify content to center. I'll refresh, and now finally, our flex items are beautifully centered inside our hero section. Let's open up DevTools to check this. So you can see when I hover over the hero section, it's now a flex container, and the flex items are nicely vertically centered. So let's now go handle horizontally centering. Now, if you look at the page, it does look like it is horizontally centered. And that's being handled because we have text align center applied on the hero section. Looking at our HTML markup here, because text align center is applied on this parent, the hero section, the H1 and paragraph are effectively inheriting that property, so they're centering. The unordered list inherits text align, the list inherits text align, and because the list is acting as a parent container for our anchor tag, text align is causing this anchor tag to center. I've already discussed this behavior earlier on in this video, where both block and inline elements will center when text align is applied to a parent container. In this case, text align is on the list item, which is the parent of the anchor tag. So because there's space to move, shown in blue above on the page, the anchor tag is able to center. So long story short, text align, because it's applied on the hero section, is centering the text of block elements and is also centering inline elements. Now, I spoke earlier in this topic that we don't really want to be using text align center as a method for centering things inside Flexbox. So for now, I'm just going to go comment it out, and you'll see our flex items now move to the left of the page. So let's go center them properly using the align items property and setting its value to center. I'll refresh, and you'll see they once again are centered, but this is using the correct method of Flexbox properties. Now, one thing you'll notice is our heading looks a bit weird now. That's because in our markup, in the hero section, we're using this BR tag to force digital world onto its own line. So if I select the heading, you can see the blue box is the heading element. And by default, if we use a line break tag, any new words will always be left align. So we actually do want to use text align center on this property to center any text in this heading. So heading back to app.css, I'm just going to copy this text align center. I'm going to remove it from the hero section. So I'll paste in the text align center. I'll uncomment it and refresh. So now our text for the heading has been centered again. Now you might be thinking, why didn't I just use text align center on the hero section and kept it how it was? This seemed like a lot of extra work just to get back to the same thing. Now that is not good practice. When we're using a flex container, we want to be using the Flexbox properties to handle spacing and alignment. Now the last thing I want to do here before we finish up the hero section is get these buttons next to each other. Looking at our HTML markup, these buttons are inside this unordered list. So we're now going to be using nested Flexbox, where this flex item, the unordered list, will become its own flex container. Let's first go add a class to this. We'll give it the class name hero btn container. I'll copy this. And then under the hero paragraph, let's go add this. We'll change its display property to flex. I'll refresh. And because this is now a flex container, our flex items, which are the two anchor tags, appear next to each other in row. Let's just go add some gap between them of 2 rems. I'll refresh. And now our anchor tags are next to each other with some space. And just to remind you once again of nested Flexbox, our hero section is the parent flex container. The H1 paragraph and unordered list are the flex items. We've now converted this flex item into its own flex container, and these list items, which hold our anchor tags, are the flex items of this flex container. So here's our parent container, and here's our nested flex container. Alright, so I'm going to put the browser full screen so we can see our beautiful work. The top of our page is now complete. It's looking really, really nice, where we've used Flexbox on both the navigation and the hero section for all spacing. Scrolling down, we're going to be handling the layout of this section using CSS Grid, which you can check out in the video in the description below. Now in principle, you could use Flexbox, where you could set each feature section to be its own flex container. But CSS Grid is a bit more purpose-built for the layout we want to achieve. I'm going to scroll down. We've also previously in this topic used Flexbox on our navigation bar and nested Flexbox to achieve the layout. Now, I want to finish off with the CTA card at the bottom here, just as a reminder of how we're doing this. As we know, we have our main container centering all the content on the page. At the moment, the CTA card is being centered using the same method, where we're applying margin of 0 and auto. We actually saw a case of this in some of the guidance earlier. We have margin 0 auto on the main container, and then on a regular content container centering it. Now, you can do this. This does work. But I would recommend inside the page using Flexbox as much as possible, because it's just a bit more powerful and a bit more versatile, and is the modern approach for handling layout on pages. So let's now go use Flexbox to center this CTA card instead of margin like we've done here. So we're going to be converting the entire CTA section into a flex container. We will then have one flex item where we currently have a div called CTA card wrapping our heading and anchor tag. Our main axis will be kept in row from left to right, which means our cross axis is running from top to bottom, and we'll then be using the justify content property to horizontally center our flex item. Now, just to note, there's also a lot of padding on the CTA card, which we'll talk about soon. But let's go use Flexbox to center this now. So I'm back inside VS Code. I first want to go recap on the HTML markup. Inside our CTA section, we have the semantic section tag with the class CTA section, and we have this div called CTA card holding the heading and anchor tag. So we're now going to go convert the CTA section into a flex container, which means the CTA card will be the single flex item. Looking at this in DevTools, you can see when I hover over the CTA section, there's space in blue left and right for our flex item, this div, to be centered. So jumping into app.css, let's scroll down to the CTA section. I'm first going to go remove the margin over here, as we don't want to use that anymore. On our CTA section, I'm then going to convert this into a flex container. I'll add display flex and use the justify content value and set it to center. I'll refresh and watch what happens. So our CTA card has been centered using Flexbox now. If I open up DevTools and select the CTA section, you can see those purple dashes and the space left and right where justify content is centering the entire CTA card inside the CTA section. Now, one thing you may have noticed when I did this is that the card actually reduced in width. Just to show you that again, I'm going to comment this out and add back the margin property here. I'll refresh, and you can see the card expanded. Removing it and uncommenting this, I'll refresh, and the card is reducing in width. So what is going on there? Just to confirm, we have achieved what we wanted. The card is centering. But there is some weird stuff going on with the width of the card when we move from margin to center the card to Flexbox. So to explain what's happening, I want to go add margin back onto our CTA card. And I'm just going to go comment out the Flexbox properties. I'll refresh. And what's happening is that when you set margin like this, and we have a max width property at play, like we see here, the browser is using this max width of the CTA card to work out the available space to put left and right. Opening up DevTools, if I select the CTA card, you can see it currently has a width of 600 pixels. And when I add on the padding left and right, we get to 600 plus 200 plus 200, which is 1000 pixels. you can see the content inside, the CTA card, Get Started Now, and the anchor tag Get Started doesn't take up the full width of the box. That's because max width is working. There is space inside the actual content container, the div, created by the max width property. So in a nutshell, when using margin like this, the way the browser is calculating the available space to apply left and right is it is looking at this max width property and seeing what remaining space there is left and right to then apply. If you don't know anything about the max width property, you can check out my video in the description below. This is not how Flexbox calculates available space. I'm going to remove this, and I'm going to add back on our Flexbox properties. I'll refresh, and you'll see now our flex item, the CTA card, has a width of only 361 pixels. You can also see now that there is no more available space inside the CTA card content container. The heading Get Started Now butts up against the left and right of the box. It's a little bit hard to see because everything's in blue, but you can see when I hover over the content box, there is no more space left and right inside this blue box. So effectively, Flexbox is centering flex items based on the content width, not the maximum width. So that's why our card has reduced in width. In order to fix this, all we need to do is on our CTA card, add in the width property and give it a value of 100%, which effectively forces the CTA card to its maximum width. I'll refresh, and you'll see now the width of our CTA card is back to 600 pixels, and we have padding left and right of 200 pixels, so max width is being used as the width of the CTA card. So just be mindful of the differences of using margin and Flexbox and how the browser calculates available space when a max width property is involved. Now, the last thing I want to comment on is that we are using padding on our CTA card, both top and bottom and left and right, to center the content inside this container to give the illusion that the content is centered. And we spoke about this method already at length throughout this chapter, where it is common to use padding to give the illusion that content is centered. Moving on, we'll learn how to control the behavior and sizing of individual flex items within a container by learning about the various properties for flex children. We'll be discussing flex items properties, flex grow, flex shrink, align self, and order. So what are flex item properties about? Flexbox also has properties that control the behavior and positioning of flex items. Looking at our Flexbox diagram, we've seen many times by now, with the flex container, flex items, and main and cross axis. So far in this topic, we've looked at a whole range of properties that apply on the flex container. These include display with the value flex, flex direction, justify content, and line items and gap. And as you know by now, these are all applied on the flex container. But in Flexbox, there are also some properties that can be applied on individual flex items. These include flex basis, flex grow, flex shrink, align self, and order. And in this chapter, we're going to be going through each of these in detail. Now, just as an important note at this point, we will be looking at these properties in detail, and some of them may seem a little bit overwhelming. And I do just want to let you know that the flex container properties we've looked at so far are much more important and are way more commonly used in CSS. However, to complete this topic, you really do need to know about the flex items and how they work so that you can keep them in your back pocket if you need them. So let's start off by looking at flex grow. Flex grow determines how flex items expand to fill extra space in a container based on a set of proportions. The CSS property looks like this: flex-grow with a numerical value like 0. 0 is in fact the default value. That is, the value applied to all flex items if we didn't change the flex grow value. So let's look in diagram form how this works. We have our flex container, and let's say it has a width of 1000 pixels. We have our flex items, and let's say each of them have a width of 100 pixels. The default behavior is that flex items do not expand to fill any available space in the flex container. So in this instance, horizontally inside the container, there's 600 pixels of available space, which is 1000 pixels minus 4 lots of 100 pixels, giving us 600 pixels. So by default, the flex items stay as they are, and any available space will remain as available space. However, we can override this and use the flex grow property, and this calculates how flex items can fill the extra space. So let's see how this works, going through step by step. Items grow based on their flex grow value relative to the total. So let's start with box 1, which is the orange box on the far left. let's give it a flex grow value of 1. For box 2, which is the second green box, let's give it a flex grow value of 2. For box 3, which is the third blue box, we'll give it a flex grow value of 0, which is just the default value. And for box 4, the fourth yellow box, let's also give it a flex grow value of 0, which again is the default value. So how this works is you would calculate the total flex grow, which is 1 plus 2 plus 0 plus 0, which is 3. So now any available space is distributed based on the flex grow value of a flex item relative to the total. So let's go see how this works. Box 1 effectively gets 1/3 of the remaining space. That is because the flex grow value of box 1 is 1 and the total is 3. So it gets 1 divided 3, or 1/3 of the remaining space. The remaining space is 600 pixels. So 1/3 of 600 pixels is 200 pixels. So our box 1, the orange box, will expand by 200 pixels, which means that the new width of box 1 is its original width, which was 100 pixels plus 200 pixels, giving us a new width of 300 pixels. Now the remaining space has obviously reduced, but we need to keep our eye on the original remaining space when doing these calculations, which is 600 pixels. So let's now take a look at box 2. Box 2 gets 2/3 of the remaining space. And that's because the flex grow value is 2, the total flex grow is 3, so it gets 2/3 of the remaining space, which is 2/3 times 600 pixels, which is 400 pixels, which means that box 2 will grow by 400 pixels to a total width of 500 pixels. Looking at box 3, it gets 0/3 of the remaining space, and that's because its flex grow value is 0. 0/3 times 600 pixels of remaining space is just 0. So box 3 remains its width of 100 pixels. And the same thing happens for box 4. It gets 0/3 of the remaining space because its flex grow value is 0. So it remains at 100 pixels. So you can see how the flex grow value of 0 is just the default value, where by default, our flex items don't grow. So let's go play around with this inside VS Code. Alright, so I've gone ahead and just created a similar setup to what we just saw in the diagram before. I have a div with the class flex container, and I have 4 flex items, where I've given each flex item the respective class flex item 1, 2, 3, and 4. And I've also just put the numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4 inside the flex items. In app.css, I've just given the body a color of white so we can easily see our numbers on our flex items, and a font size of 30 pixels. And we know this will be inherited by our flex items. For the flex container, I've given it a background color of light gray, a height of 500 pixels, and a width of 1000 pixels. I've also applied the display flex property so that this is a flex container. For each flex item, they all have a width of 100 pixels and a height of 100 pixels, and different background colors, blue, purple, red, and green. So let's check this out in the browser. Okay, so nothing crazy going on. You can see our gray flex container and our 4 flex items. Because the flex container is 1000 pixels wide, and each flex item is 100 pixels wide, the remaining space is 600 pixels. Let's open up DevTools, and you can see this purple hatched box is going to have a width of 600 pixels. And as you'll note, each flex item, by default, doesn't expand to fill this extra space. In the background, they all have a flex grow value of 0. If I set that on item 1 and refresh, you'll see there'll be no change. So let's now go set the flex grow values we did before. We had a flex grow value of 1 on flex item 1, a flex grow value of 2 on item 2, a flex grow value of 0 on item 3, and a flex grow value of 0 on item 4. Now, if you remember, the way flex grow works is it distributes available space onto our flex items. It does this by working out the total of the flex grow, which is 1 plus 2 plus 0 plus 0, which is 3, and then takes the flex grow value, divides it by that total, and multiplies it by the available space. So I'll refresh my browser, and you'll see now flex item 1 has a width of 300 pixels because it's getting 1/3 of the available space, which is 1/3 times 600 pixels, plus the original width of 100 pixels to give us a width of 300 pixels. And you can actually see inside DevTools, the original width has this hatched line, and you have this arrow showing how the flex item has grown by 200 pixels. Flex item 2 now has a total width of 500 pixels, which is 2/3 times 600 pixels, which is 400 pixels, plus the original width of 100 pixels. And flex item 3 and 4 have not grown at all because their flex grow value is 0, and 0 times 600 is 0, so no additional space is added onto flex item 3 or 4. So let's now move on to flex shrink. Flex shrink determines how flex items shrink relative to others in a container where there isn't enough space. So it's kind of the exact opposite of flex grow. The CSS property looks like this, flex-shrink, with a numerical value like 1, where 1 is actually the default value. So let's first take a look at what happens by default when the flex shrink value is 1. We have our flex container with the width of 1000 pixels. We have our 4 flex items, which each have a width of 300 pixels. So 4 times 300 pixels is a total of 1200 pixels, which means that these flex items won't fit inside the flex container. However, what's happening behind the scenes is that these flex items are actually forced inside the container. So their actual width will be 250 pixels. So each flex item has effectively reduced in width by 50 pixels. That's because the amount these flex items would have overflown would have been 200 pixels, and the 200 pixels is divided by 4 to give us 50 pixels. So each of these flex items shrink at the same proportion. And that's because behind the scenes, each flex item has a default value of flex shrink 1. So let's check out this default behavior in VS Code. So I'm back inside the file we were working on earlier. For each flex item, I'm now going to update its width to 300 pixels and remove the flex grow value. I've done it on flex item 1. Let's do it on flex item 2, 3, and 4. I'll refresh. And what you'll see is that we set a width of 300 pixels on our flex items. We have 4 of them, which means the total width of this should be 1200 pixels. And because our flex container has a width of 1000 pixels, we would expect there to be some overflow. If I open up DevTools and check this flex item here, you can see its width is 250 pixels, not 300. And you can actually see on the right, there's an arrow pointing left, showing how much it's shrunk by. Now, because by default, each flex shrink value is 1, so I'm just explicitly setting on flex item 1, but behind the scenes, this is currently set on flex item 2, 3, and 4. It means that each flex item will shrink by the same proportion. As I mentioned, the overflow value would be 1200 pixels minus 1000 pixels, so 200 pixels. That 200 pixels is then just distributed equally to each flex item to absorb that space. So effectively, each flex item reduces in width by 50 pixels, so its new width is 300 pixels minus 50 pixels, which is 250 pixels. We can see here. All right, I'm just going to remove this flex shrink value over there. So now let's see what happens when we change our flex shrink value to 0. We have our flex container with the width of 1000 pixels, and by setting flex shrink to 0 on each flex item means that we've effectively removed this default behavior of flex items shrinking to fit inside the container. So now our flex items will overflow. They will be the width we actually set them, which is 300 pixels, and there's overflow now of 200 pixels. So setting a flex shrink value of 0 means that your flex items don't shrink. Let's check this out in VS Code. So on each flex item, I'm going to add a flex shrink value of 0. And I'll copy this for each flex item. Okay, I'll refresh. I'll zoom out a bit. And you can now see that our flex items are extending beyond the flex container. You can see this hashed purple is the amount we're overflowing by. So let's now go see what happens when we apply different values to flex shrink. We'll be using the same setup we've just looked at. So items shrink based on their flex shrink value relative to the total. So this is kind of similar to flex grow, but it now has to do with shrinking. Let's look at box 1 to start. Let's give it a flex shrink value of 2. Box 2, let's give it a flex shrink value of 6. For box 3, let's give it a flex shrink value of 1, which is the default value. For box 4, let's also give it a flex shrink value of 1. So we now work out the total flex shrink, which is 2 plus 6 plus 1 plus 1, which equals 10. So what this means is that box 1 absorbs 0.2 of the overflow space. That is its own shrink value of 2 divided by the total 10, which is 0.2. The overflow space is 200 pixels. 0.2 times 200 pixels is 40 pixels. So box 1 is going to reduce by 40 pixels. So we have our flex container with the width of 1000 pixels, and box 1 now has a width of 260 pixels. which is 300 pixels minus 40 pixels. For box 2, it's going to absorb 0.6 of the overflow space. 0.6 is from box 2's shrink value of 6 divided total 10. The overflow space is 200 pixels. 0.6 times 200 pixels is 120 pixels. So box 2 is going to reduce by 120 pixels, which means the new width of box 2 is 180 pixels. That is 300 pixels minus 120 pixels, which is 180 pixels. For box 3, it's going to absorb 0.1 of the overflow space. That is 0.1 times 200 pixels, which is 20 pixels. So the new width of box 3 will be 280 pixels. That is 300 pixels minus 20 pixels. And for box 4, it's the same thing. It absorbs 0.1 of the overflow space, which we know is 20 pixels. So box 4 will now have a width of 280 pixels. So let's go play around with this inside VS Code. So this is where we left off. I'm now going to go give the same flex shrink values we just saw. On flex item 1, that was 2. On flex item 2, that was 6. Flex item 3, it was 1. And flex item 4, that was 1. I'll refresh, and you'll see our flex items have now shrunk in proportion of each flex item's shrink value divided by the total, which in this case was 10. Looking at flex item 1, its new width is 260 pixels. Flex item 2, 180 pixels. Flex item 3, 280 pixels. And flex item 4, 280 pixels. And we just saw earlier how all these widths are calculated. So let's now move on to the next flex item property, which is align self. Align self sets individual flex items alignment by overriding the flex container's default align items value. So let's have a look at this. We have our standard setup of our flex container, flex items, and main and cross axis. So what align self allows us to do is align an individual flex item, like the one in green, along the cross axis. The CSS property looks like this: align-self and a value like flex end. Let's say that this property is applied on the green flex item. What this will effectively do is override any aligned items value, which we know is applied on the flex container to all flex items and results in aligning just that flex item. So we'd end up looking like this, where just the green flex item is positioned flex end. Now currently, our flex items would have a property like align items flex start. That is, they're positioned at the start of the cross axis, but applying align self onto a flex item overrides this for a flex item. So let's check out all the values we can have for align self. The first value is align self auto, and this is just the default value. All this is saying is that if align items has a value, then the flex items will have that same value. Long story short, if you have an align items value, each flex item is just given that value by default, which makes sense. If there is no align items value on the flex container, and our flex items have a fixed height, it just means by default our flex items will be at the start of the cross axis, like we see here. The next value is align self stretch, which when applied to a flex item, will stretch that flex item along the cross axis. The next value is flex start, which would position an individual flex item at the start of the cross axis. Now, if no flex items value is on our flex container, then we're not going to see any effect here. But if we did say have flex items set to flex end, we would then see our flex items at the bottom of the cross axis and a single flex item at the start of the cross axis. The next value is align self flex end, where we would now see a flex item at the end of the cross axis. The next value is align self center, which would position an individual flex item in the center of the cross axis. And to see the last value, I'm going to add the align items value flex end and apply align self baseline. So what we'd end up with is this. We're applying align items flex end, so all our flex items would be at the end of the cross axis, but then an individual flex item would be positioned baseline. That is, it's positioned on the baseline of its own text, like this. So let's go play around with these inside VS Code. Alright, so I'm back in the file we were working in earlier. For each flex item, I'm just going to go remove the flex shrink value and give it a width of 200 pixels. I'll do this for flex item 1, flex item 2, flex item 3, and flex item 4. So I'll refresh my browser, and our flex items are now back inside our flex container. Now let's quickly recap the setup we have. Our main axis is in row going from left to right, and our cross axis is going from top to bottom. Because our flex items have a fixed height of 100 pixels, it means that by default, they're just going to be at the top of the flex container. So let's go and apply some align self properties. I'll be doing this all for flex item 2. Let's go apply align self and set its value to auto. I'll refresh, and you'll see nothing happens. This is just taking the align self value set on the flex container, which is not set, so it's just taking the default value of putting it at the start. If I change the flex container's align items value to something like flex end, all our flex items move to the end of the cross axis. And again, align self auto is effectively just applying flex end onto flex item 2. It's just taking whatever value is being applied on the flex container. I'm actually just going to leave the align items value as flex end now, as it will help me better demonstrate the other properties. Let's change auto to the next value we looked at, which was stretch. I'll refresh, and align self is stretching. Well, it isn't really, but what's happening is that because this has a fixed height, the flex item is unable to stretch, and if that's the case, it'll just move to the top of the flex container. If I comment out the height for a second and refresh, you'll see that the flex item does in fact stretch. All right, I'm going to uncomment this, and let's look at the next value, which is flex start. I'll refresh, and now flex 2 is actually at the start of the cross axis. The next value is flex end. I'll refresh, and this is just moving it in the same position as all the other flex items set here. To see the impact of this, let's change this to flex start. I'll refresh, and you can see all our flex items are at the top, where flex item 2 is now at the bottom. All right, I'm just going to put this back to flex end. The next value we looked at was center, and this will center this flex item along the cross axis. And for the last value, baseline, to better demonstrate this, I'm going to remove the height on flex item 2, and I'm going to give it a font size of 50 pixels. Let's update the align self to baseline. I'll refresh, and what's happening is that this flex item is positioned according to the baseline of itself, which is just under the 2 here. So as I mentioned at the start of the chapter, this can all seem overwhelming, learning all of these new align self values. I really wouldn't worry too much about it. As I've mentioned, aligning flex items on the container with justify content and align items is way more common to do. So let's finally take a look at the last flex item property, which is order. Order changes the visual order of flex items independent of their order in the HTML markup. The CSS property looks like this: order with a numerical value, where 0 is the default value for all flex items. So let's take a look at how this works. We have our flex container and our flex items, where we can see 0 is the default values for all of them. So the way the orange, green, blue, and yellow box are appearing is just the order they appear in the HTML. What we can do is override the order of the flex items no matter what the HTML is. Looking at an example, so what we could do is on our third flex item, the blue box, we could set a value of -1. This would make it come first. Let's leave the green and yellow box, that is the second and fourth box, as 0. So they'll appear like this: the green box first, followed by the yellow box. That is because the green box appears first in the HTML markup before the yellow box. And then we can apply a value of 1 to the first box, which will now be the last flex item. So the order number is moving us from lower order numbers to higher order numbers. And once again, we're completely overriding the position of the flex item as it appears in the HTML. So let's go play around with this inside VS Code. So I've picked up where we left off. I'm just going to go remove this align self value, remove the font size, and uncomment the height. I'll refresh, and let's go play around with order. Let's have our third flex item now appear first. I'll put an order there of -1. For flex item 2 and 4, I'm just going to leave those alone, which means by default, the order value is 0 for 2 and 4. For flex item 1, let's make that come last. So I'm going to go give it an order of 1. I'll refresh, and you can see flex item 3 is now first, as it has the lowest order value. 2 and 4 have an order of 0, so they appear here, and flex item 1 has the highest order value of 1. Now I could change this to something massive like 99. It doesn't matter. It's just looking at the numbers moving from left to right. And I don't have to use negative numbers to maintain this order. I could change this to 1, Flex item 2 is in position 2, so let's give it an order of 2. Flex item 4 is in position 3, so let's give it an order of 3. And flex item 1 is in position 4, so let's give it an order of 4. I'll refresh and you'll see there's no change, as we're moving from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. The reason I used negative numbers earlier, it's because it allows me not to then put order values on some of the flex items. So sometimes it can be more efficient using negative values and relying on the default value for some of your flex items. So let's wrap up this chapter by building the next summary card, Flex Children. We looked at several Flex Children properties. The first was Flex Grow, which was about how flex items can grow to fill extra space. We looked at an example with a flex container and 4 flex items with equal width. We can also see there's extra space inside the flex container. And by default, the flex items won't expand to fill the extra space. But we can override this using the Flex Grow property. We set a Flex Grow value of 1 on box 1, a Flex Grow value of 2 on box 2, a Flex Grow value of 0 on box 3, and 0 is the default value, meaning it won't grow, and also a Flex Grow value of 0 on box 4. The way it works is the total Flex Grow value is calculated, which is 1 plus 2 plus 0 plus 0, which equals 3. The flex items will then fill the extra space like this, where the first flex item gets 1/3 of the extra space. That is its own Flex Grow value, 1 divided by the total, 3. The second flex item gets 2/3 of the extra space, which is its own Flex Grow value of 2, divided by the total of 3. And because box 3 and box 4 both have a Flex Grow value of 0, they won't absorb any extra space, so they remain the same size as they originally were. We then looked at Flex Shrink. This is about how flex items shrink where there isn't space. We looked at an example with a flex container. We saw that by default, the flex shrink value was 1, which means that flex items will by default shrink within the container in the same proportion of any overflow. We saw that we could set the flex shrink value to 0, which would then result in our flex items overflowing, like this. Flex shrink was then the proportion of how each flex item absorbs this overflow space in order to fit inside the container. On the first box, we set a flex shrink value of 2. On the second box, we set a flex shrink value of 6. On the third box, a flex shrink value of 1, which is just the default value. And on box 4, we also set a flex shrink value of 1, which again is the default value. The way flex shrink works is the total flex shrink is calculated, which is 2 plus 6 plus 1 plus 1, which equals 10. And this results in our flex items all fitting within the container like this, where the first box absorbs 0.2 of the overflow space, that is its own flex shrink value of 2 divided by the total of 10. The second box absorbs 0.6 of the overflow space, that is its own flex shrink value of 6 divided by the total of 10. Box 3 then absorbs 0.1 of the overflow space by the same logic, and box 4 also absorbs 0.1 of the overflow space, the exact same as box 3. We then looked at the align self property, which sets individual flex item alignment along the cross-axis, and will override any align items value set on the flex container. The first value we looked at was align self auto, which is just the default value, and just takes whatever the value is set for align items. The next value was align self stretch, where you can see the green box has stretched, and this would only work if the green box does not have a set height, but is just content, like some text. We saw align self flex start. To better show this, I've set the align items value to flex end, which means all our flex items will be at the end of the cross-axis, and you can see the green box is at the start of the cross-axis. The next value was align self flex end, and you can see the green box is at the end of the cross-axis. The next value was align self center, where you can see the green box is centered along the cross-axis. And the final value was align self baseline, where when your flex item has some text, it will align according to the baseline of its own text. The last property we looked at was order. This was where we could override the order of our flex items as they appear in the HTML. The property looked like this, order with a numerical value, where 0 is the default. We could then do something like this, where we have a flex item with the order value of -1, the next flex item, the order value 0, the next flex item, the order value 1, and the last flex item with an order value of 2. So the flex items are being ordered from lower value to higher value. And again, this completely overrides the order they appear in the HTML. In the final chapter, we'll explore how to handle items that don't fit in a row and control their alignment using flex wrap and align content. We'll be discussing flex items shrinking behavior, flex wrap property, align content property, and align content values. So let's first quickly recap the shrinking behavior of flex items. If flex items are larger than their container, by default, they will shrink to fit inside. We saw this in the previous chapter, where we have a flex shrink value of 1, which is the default value. What this results in is inside our flex container, which let's say is 1000 pixels, our flex items will shrink to fit inside this container. So let's say these flex items are 300 pixels wide. That would mean that the total width of these flex items is 1200 pixels, so we should expect to see overflow. But what's happening is that behind the scenes, our flex items have a flex shrink value of 1, which means that each flex item is absorbing the overflow space. So that 200 pixels is effectively divided by 4, so each flex item will absorb 50 pixels. So the width of the flex items will be 250 pixels. We saw that we could set a flex shrink value of 0, which effectively removes the shrinking behavior. So we end up with our container of 1000 pixels, but now our flex items will be their actual width of 300 pixels, and you can see we now overflow the container. So let's again check this out in VS Code. So I've got a very similar setup to what we saw in the previous chapter. I have a flex container with 4 flex items. Inside app.css, we have our body, where we're applying the color white to our text and a font size of 30 pixels. Our flex container has a background color of light gray, a height of 500 pixels, a width of 1000 pixels, and the display property is set to flex, so that each of our flex items are now in a row. Each flex item is 300 pixels by 100 pixels, and each have a different background color. So the first thing I want to do is just open up DevTools. I'll select our flex item, and you can see in the box model, its actual width is 250 pixels. If I go hover over it, if you remember, we also have that arrow on the right, visually showing how the flex item is shrunk. I'm going to go change the flex shrink value on each flex item to 0 to effectively remove the shrinking behavior. And I'm going to apply this on each of our flex items. I'll refresh, and you can see our flex items now do overflow the container. So when we have this situation of flex items overflowing the flex container, there is something else we can do here, and that's using flex wrap. Flex wrap pushes flex items onto multiple lines instead of being forced to fit on a single line when they exceed the container. The CSS property looks like this, where flex-wrap is the property, and in this case, wrap is the value. It's important to note that flex wrap is set on the flex container. The values we can use include no wrap, wrap, and wrap reverse, where no wrap is the default value. So flex wrap can be used in the specific case when your flex items exceed the container. Like in the demonstration I just showed you in VS Code, that would be an opportunity to use flex wrap. Now flex wrap works a bit differently if there is height or no height set on the parent container. Let's look at a general block container first. That is, when our flex container has no set height. The way flex wrap works here is that our flex items will appear next to each other, and to fit the flex item that is going to wrap onto the next line, the flex container expands. Looking now at a flex container with a set height, like this one here, when the flex items wrap, there's actually a line dividing the flex container in two, so the rows divide equally. Our flex items will appear as usual, and then the flex item which we're wrapping onto the next row will appear at the start of the divided row. Let's go play around with this inside VS Code. So I'm back inside the file we were working on earlier. Let's go first look at the case when there is no set height on the flex container. I'm just going to go comment this out and refresh. So what this means now is that our flex items are setting the height of the container. And the container in light gray is now hidden because our flex items go beyond the width of the flex container. Now I'm just going to go remove the flex shrink values as we no longer need those anymore. I just did that before to demonstrate that our flex items can overflow, but by default, the flex shrink value of 1 applied behind the scenes to each flex item ensures that they fit within the container. I'll refresh, so now our flex items are back to 250 pixels wide, all within the flex container. Now this is a setup where we can use flex wrap, and once again, that's because our flex items, when added up, will overflow. If our flex items fitted within the container, flex wrap simply wouldn't work. It only works when your flex items can extend beyond the flex container. So let's go add a flex wrap property. I'm first going to set the default value of no wrap. I'll refresh and you'll see there's no change. And that's because by default, our flex items won't wrap. Let's change the value now to wrap. I'll refresh and you'll see the flex item, which would have been overflowing, now wraps onto its own line. And the container has expanded in height to allow this flex item onto its own row. Let's go apply the other value of wrap reverse. I'll refresh. And as you can see, this effectively flips our different rows. All right, I'm just going to comment this out for now. Let's now go look at the other case by adding our height back in. I'll refresh. And again, we can see that our flex items are shrinking inside the flex container. Let's go wrap these. I'll uncomment this. And let's just use the value wrap. I'll refresh. And now you can see that when we have a set height, the height is divided by 2, and the flex item that was overflowing now appears at the start of this row. So just be mindful of how wrap works when there's height or no height set on the flex container. And really just to drive this point home, this property only works in a situation where your flex items do exceed the width of the container. So just to show you this, if I go and update all the flex item widths to 200 pixels, if I sum these up now, 4 times 200 is 800 pixels, which is less than the total width of the container of 1000 pixels. We still have our flex wrap property applied, so if I refresh, you'll see they don't wrap onto another line. And that's because this only works when the sum of the width of your flex items exceeds the width of the container. Now, when we do have our flex items wrapping onto a new line, there is an additional property that allows us to control the alignment of the wrapped flex items. We do this with the align content property. Do not get this confused with align items, where align items is used to space and align properties along the cross-axis. Align content controls the alignment of flex items along the cross-axis when there are multiple rows of flex items. I really want to highlight, it's when there are multiple rows of flex items. So you can only use align content when you apply flex wrap and your flex items are on multiple rows. In CSS, it looks like this, where align-content is the property, and flex start is an example of a value. Also, really importantly, align content is set on the flex container. So let's have a look at the setup of this. We have our flex container. In this example, I'm looking at one with a fixed height. We have our flex items, which are wrapping onto different rows. We have our main axis and our cross axis. So align content is the alignment of flex items on the cross axis when there are multiple rows of flex items. That is, when we are applying flex wrap. Let's look now at all the different align content values. The first value is align content stretch, which is just the default value. In our setup, our flex items will essentially stretch their entire height. The next value is flex start, where our flex items are all at the start of the cross-axis and butt up against each other vertically like this. The next value is flex end, where our flex items are now at the end of the cross-axis. The next value is center, where our flex items wrap in the center along the cross-axis. The next value is space between, where our flex items have maximum space between them. And the last value is space around, where our flex items have equal space around them. So let's go play around with these inside VS Code. All right, so I'm back inside the file we were working on earlier. I also just went and changed the width back to 300 pixels so that our flex items wrap. Let's go add the align content property, and I'm going to set the value to its default value of stretch. I'll refresh and you'll see nothing happens. Now what's actually happening is that because our flex items have a fixed height, they actually can't stretch. So they just end up looking like this, where the rows divide by 2 and they are just their height. What I'm going to do to better demonstrate the align content property is just turn off the height of each flex item and let the height be determined by the height of each number in each flex item. So I'll refresh and you can now see that our flex items do stretch the height of their rows. Let's go play with all the different values. We'll do flex start. I'll refresh and you can see our flex items all start at the start of the cross axis. Let's do flex end. I'll refresh and you can see our flex items move to the end of the cross axis. The next value we looked at was center. I'll refresh and our flex items now appear in the center. The next value was space between. I'll refresh and you'll see this creates the maximum space between our rows of flex items. The last value we saw was space around. So let's update this. Opening up DevTools, there's now equal space, top and bottom, of the rows of flex items. So the space above here and below here, and the space above here and below here are all equal. Now I just want to quickly highlight that the align content property can only be used when we have flex wrap enabled. I'm going to comment out flex wrap, I'll refresh, and you can see the align content property is doing absolutely nothing. I'm going to add this back on and refresh. Now I also just want to show you that align items still does work. If I go align items and set the value to say flex start, I'll refresh, and you can see our flex items are now at the start of the cross axis. However, as soon as I add back in an align content value like space around, I'll refresh, you'll see that the align content value completely overrides the align items value. As a general rule of thumb, you should be using align content when flex wrap is enabled, and align items for most cases when your flex items are inside the flex container. Now I know this can be really intimidating and confusing with align content, align items. My general word of advice is don't really worry too much about flex wrap and align content. The majority of layouts you're going to be working with are just a regular flex container where you're going to be using the align items value that we've been using throughout this topic. So let's now take a look at some flex wrap guidance. As I've kind of mentioned, I wouldn't worry too much about flex wrap as it's not often required. But let's look at some cases where you could use it. Wrapping is useful for simple linear layouts when elements need to wrap onto multiple lines. Taking a look at an example of this, we have this page over here with these logos showcasing where this application has been seen in the media. When you reduce the width of the browser, these logos wrap onto two different rows. So let's go check out an example of this in the browser. On this page here, when I scroll down, you can see company logos that are using this application. Let's go open up DevTools. I'll select the flex container over here. You can see it's going across two rows, which is being controlled by this flex wrap property here. If I turn the flex wrap property off, you can see they all go inside the flex container. Now the reason I wouldn't worry too much about flex wrap is that the truth is when we start thinking about layouts like this, which are two-dimensional, that is, they contain rows and columns, this is actually a grid layout. I have a video in the description below on CSS Grid that goes into the same level of detail you've experienced in this video, so I do recommend you check it out. Just to give you a taster, you can see a very similar layout here to what we saw before, of rows and columns. That is, a two-dimensional grid layout. If I go inspect this layout, you can see over here the word grid. So that's why I wouldn't really worry too much about flex wrap. When layouts need both rows and columns, grid is the way to go. And I spent a lot of time in my CSS Grid video in the description below going through this. So let's finish up by building our next summary card, flex wrap and align content. We first looked at flex wrap, which is when flex items wrap onto multiple lines if they exceed the container. In CSS, it looked like this, where the values include no wrap, wrap, and wrap reverse, where no wrap is the default value. We then looked at two different cases. The first is the flex container with no height. We saw that the flex items set the height of the container, and as the flex item wraps onto another line, the container expands. We then looked at a container with a set height, and in this case, the container is split into two, where rows divide equally, and our flex items are placed at the top of each row. We then looked at align content. Align content dealt with flex alignment along the cross-axis when there are multiple rows. We looked at all the values, including align content stretch, which is just a default value, and in diagram form, our flex items just stretch the full width of their row. Align content flex start is when our flex items go to the start of the flex container along the cross-axis. Align content flex end is when our flex items go to the end of the flex container along the cross-axis. Align content center is when our flex items center along the cross-axis. Align content space between is when space is created between our flex items, such that the top row of flex items touches the top of the flex container, and the bottom flex items touch the bottom of the container. And the final value was space around, which creates space between the rows of flex items and between the rows and the edge of the flex container. If you enjoyed this style of teaching and are looking at mastering CSS, you can join me in my CSS full course, which is available for free on my channel. It's the world's most detailed CSS full course designed for complete beginners and covers everything you need to know to code CSS at a professional level. In the course, you'll experience the same high-quality teaching and build the Quill homepage from scratch. Join me today and also make sure to subscribe to my channel to stay in the loop with new releases. See you in the CSS full course.